Hey my dear listener, before we start, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Comment down where are you from and what's your time right now. Let's jump into the video. Now I'll begin with story 1. A Hanseatic cruise battle with the Baltic Sea. You are standing on the docks of Lubeck, sometime around the year 1361. The air is thick with brine, and the timbers creak under the weight of barrels filled with salt herring, wax, rye, and iron tools. This is a Hanseatic cog, a single-masted merchant vessel, its square sail furled and waiting. The ship is large by medieval standards, perhaps 20 meters long, 7 meters wide, but it looks stout more than swift. It is built for cargo, not speed. And certainly not for war, though it carries weapons all the same. Not for conquest, but for protection against pirates and the sea itself. The cog has no keel in the way you might imagine. Instead, it has a flat bottom ideal for shallow harbors, but problematic in heavy swells. Its hull is clinker-built overlapping planks fastened with iron rivets and caulked with tar and moss. It is a solid method, proven over generations, but the weakest point is always the same: the human element. Most aboard are not trained sailors. They are merchants, hired laborers, a few apprentices, and the ship's master, who is perhaps the only man aboard who has made this journey a dozen times. His name has not survived history, but his role is essential. He is not just a captain. He is navigator, disciplinarian, mechanic, and judge. The success of this voyage, its safety, its profit, its survival rests on his judgment. The routine before the chaos. The early days of the voyage are uneventful. The cog hugs the coast, traveling northeast past Wismar, then Stralsund, toward Visby on the island of Gotland. The sea is flat, the wind cooperative. Routines develop. One crew member shovels the bilge, another prepares a mixture of salted oats for the crew's meal. Sleep is taken in shifts. There are no cabins, just canvas tarps stretched over planks. The merchant men try to keep their woolen cloaks dry, but mildew creeps into everything. Navigation is done with the sky and the shoreline. There is no compass on this ship. Soundings are taken with a lead line. Depth is judged in fathoms, and charts are little more than annotated sketches. But this is normal. To the men aboard, this is a trip like many before it. Familiar, slow, safe. Until the wind changes. Storms in the Baltic. The Baltic Sea is not the vast Atlantic, but it can be cruel. Its storms are sudden and its shallows deceptive. By the time the sky darkens over the Gulf of Riga, the crew is no longer eating. The wind is now from the northeast, howling against the sail. The master orders it lowered. The crew obeys, fumbling with the sheets and lines, hands raw from rope burns. Rain falls sideways. The waves grow not towering but irregular and sharp, slapping the hull with punishing rhythm. The flat bottom of the cog causes it to rock violently, side to side. The cargo tied down with hemp rope begins to shift. Barrels creak and slide. One breaks loose and shatters against the starboard hull. The ship groans. This is the moment where the difference between life and death narrows, not through heroism, but through discipline. The men must rebalance the load, keep the bilge clear, stay awake, and not panic. Cold is a bigger killer than waves. Wet clothes lead to shivering. Shivering leads to mistakes. Mistakes lead to capsized ships. Survival strategies. There is no such thing as a lifeboat. The cog itself is the lifeboat. If it fails, there are planks to cling to, perhaps a hatch to float on, but most who fall overboard die within minutes. Hypothermia in the Baltic is merciless. The ship's master knows this. He keeps the men on task. No prayers, no wailing, just labor. The rudder is manned with a tiller, heavy and slick with rain. 2 men work it at once, trying to keep the ship facing the waves to avoid broaching. They cannot sleep. The tiller cannot be abandoned. Below deck, some cargo has shifted. Grain has burst from a barrel, mixing with seawater to form a slippery paste. A young apprentice tries to clean it with a board. He slips, hits his head, and is dragged to a dry corner. No one can help him now. They do not even stop working. The cog has no anchor that can be dropped in deep water, And there are no harbors here, only hostile coastlines and shallow shoals. To find shelter means risking running aground, but staying in open water means enduring the storm. When the caulking fails, as the storm reaches its height, the caulking begins to give. The pitch-softened moss between the planks loosens and water sprays in through the hull, not in torrents, but in relentless drips and trickles. The bilge is no longer a shallow pool, it is a foot deep. The pump is man-powered, a simple crank system. It has to run constantly. If it fails, the cog will sink not from a wave, but from weight. One of the men vomits from exhaustion. Another slips, tearing the skin from his palm. Still, the work continues. They are not heroes, just men, tired, wet, and afraid. The only comfort is that storms do not last forever. But how long is too long? As dawn breaks, the storm is still raging, and now the shoreline is no longer visible. They are lost, off course, and still in danger. The ship groans with each wave, its seams popping louder. The crew is dwindling in strength. And the master, silent for most of the night, now faces a new question. Do they press on into open sea or risk a blind landing on an unknown coast? The light is gray, not dawn as they had hoped, but a break in the clouds. Cold mist hovers just above the waterline, masking the distance between sea and sky. You are still aboard the cog, still alive, though the meaning of that word is being tested. The storm is not over, only quieter. The wind gusts and shudders now instead of howls. The crew is soaked, weakened, and grimly obedient. The master gives no speeches. He does not gather the crew or ask their opinion. Leadership in this era is not democratic. He has made his decision before anyone notices. The tiller groans as it is shifted. The ship begins to turn not into the open sea, but toward what he hopes is the coast of Estonia. This decision will either save everyone on board or doom them all. The calculations of a medieval mind. There is no compass, no sextant. The stars have been obscured for days. What little direction remains is judged by wind, wave, and instinct. To a modern mind, the choice to steer toward land without precise knowledge may seem foolish. But to the medieval sailor, there are rules hard-won and repeated in taverns, on docks, in whispered stories. Rule 1. In prolonged storms, landfall is your best chance. Rule 2. Stay near trade routes if you survive. Someone may find you. Rule 3. Avoid rocky coastlines, but remember that no coast is ever gentle in a storm. The Baltic, even in summer, offers only jagged salvation. Estonia, Latvia, Finland, and the islands of a land are a cruel maze of forests and stones. But many Hanseatic sailors believe that God has left clues for those with experience. That line of darker water near the horizon, it may be the mouth of a river. The sudden stillness in the waves could mean a shoal or a sandbar before a harbor. The cries of birds, always a sign of land, unless, of course, they are merely following the ship. Land in sight and the price of misjudgment. It is midday when someone spots the gray blur of coastline, barely more than a rise in the mist. It could be salvation, or a death trap. The crew's chatter rises for the first time in hours. Some cross themselves. Others mutter old prayers. Still others resume bailing water, in anticipation of needing every second to stay afloat. The master orders the sail raised just a little, enough to provide steerage, not speed. The rudder creaks, the lines tighten. A cry goes out, reef, but it's too late. The hull strikes something hard beneath the waterline. It is not a massive collision, there's no splintering crash, no screams, but the damage is immediate. The cog lists slightly. Water enters faster now. They are not yet wrecked, but the race is on. Shifting from survival to escape. In medieval maritime culture, there is a harsh truth. The ship is secondary to the cargo, but the crew's lives, those come third, and in storms, priorities shift again. The barrels of rye are the first to be pushed overboard, then the salted fish. It's a decision both economic and emotional. Those goods may have been months in the making, but the cog is lower in the water than it should be. Every ounce counts. Next goes the spare mast and the forge tools. Axes, shovels, hammers useful if they reach shore, but fatal if they sink with the weight. By now the coast is clearer. It is a low, forested shoreline with outcroppings of rock and patches of sand. There is no harbor, no breakwater, just the hope that the slope is gentle enough for a beaching. The master shouts orders, ready the lines, coil the ropes, prepare for grounding. The waves push the cog sideways as they near land, threatening to broach her. A few men try to stabilize her with a long pole, a futile act, but one born of desperate habit. The prow rises on a wave, then crashes down into surf. The flat hull grinds against the seafloor. They are stuck, and the next wave may split the ship in half. The discipline of disembarking. Modern ideas of evacuation don't apply here. There is no line of lifeboats, no flare, no call to abandon ship. Instead, there is order. One by one, they tie themselves to ropes and descend into waist-deep water, wading or swimming toward shore. The problem isn't the water, it's the cold, and the weight. Medieval clothing is heavy wool cloaks, leather belts, linen tunics. Once soaked, they drag the body down like ballast. 2 men are lost to the surf almost immediately. No screams, just absence. But the rest make it to shore, crawling through coarse sand and rockweed. The forest looms just beyond. Still, they cannot rest. The ship is still partly intact if it breaks apart in the next tide, so too do their chances of food, shelter, and tools. A party is sent back aboard, tethered by rope to retrieve what they can. Dried meat, waxed flints, even fragments of sailcloth. Everything is soaked, but dry can come later. For now it must be had. The wilderness beyond the wreck. They do not know exactly where they are. The coast is unfamiliar, the forest quiet. The only signs of life are bird calls and the rustling of trees. Is it Livonian territory or Finnish? Could this be part of Sweden, a Hanseatic ally or a threat? Medieval maps do not provide this level of certainty. To be shipwrecked is not just to face exposure or hunger. It is to face political unknowns. The crew decides to build a shelter near the tree line using broken timbers and the sailcloth. Fires are started using kindling dried with careful effort. No one speaks of rescue yet. The focus is immediate. Survive the first night, stay warm, stay hidden. The master keeps watch. His eyes are on the tree line, not the sea. Because in these woods, survival isn't about waves anymore. Unexpected visitors. 3 days pass. The ship begins to break apart, its seams loosening with each tide. The cargo is already ruined, the hull cracked. But the men survive, living on stale oats and boiled roots. They fish poorly. They sleep uneasily. Some argue about walking inland. Others insist on staying put. It is the 6th day when figures appear at the edge of the forest, 3 men, dressed in furs and leather, carrying spears. They are not raiders, but they are not smiling either. The encounter is tense. Language barriers turn speech into pantomime. The Hanseatic crew offers salt as a gift, always a safe choice. One of the locals nods and gestures inland. He points to the sky, then mimics cold. A warning, or an invitation. The master considers the meaning carefully. Winter is not yet here, but on this coast, the season comes early. And without tools, without food stores, they will not last. But can they trust strangers? A choice in the forest. Night falls again. The crew gathers around the fire. They discuss in hushed tones whether to stay and risk starvation or follow the locals inland. The master listens more than he speaks. Finally, he stands. He does not give a speech. He simply nods toward the forest and says, "We go tomorrow." The fire has gone out, not by neglect but by design. Smoke is a signal, one that may draw help or hostility. So when the Hanseatic master wakes before dawn, he snuffs the embers with wet moss. The morning is damp and bitter. The ship is half swallowed by the sea now, its hull broken, its mast sagging like a snapped bone. The forest awaits. The crew gathers what remains: strips of sailcloth, rust-spotted knives, ropes that now smell permanently of salt. Most of them wear the same clothes they boarded the cog in. Weeks ago, it might have been fine wool or merchant's linen. Now it is a patchwork of grime, tears, and cold. They follow the local men who appeared days earlier. Whether guides or jailers, no one knows. But they offered food, dried fish, boiled bark, and accepted salt and coin in return. In the medieval world, that's often the beginning of peace. But no one lets go of their makeshift weapons. Medieval survival, not lost, just unwelcome. The forest is not a wilderness in the modern sense. These woods are owned, claimed, traversed. Every path, even if overgrown, is known to someone. These are not wild lands, they are simply not your lands. The trees are mostly pine and birch. The ground is uneven, tangled with roots and soggy earth. The crew walks in a line, the master near the front. He watches everything: how the locals move, how they whisper to each other, how they carry their spears low, not threatening, but ready. Within hours, the shipwreck is a memory behind them. The crew has entered the unknown. Arrival at a settlement. The path ends at a clearing. Smoke curls from low huts, their roofs thatched in straw and sod. A wooden palisade surrounds the main dwellings. Pigs squeal nearby and women peer cautiously from doorways. Children scatter. A dog barks, is silenced. This is not a city or even a town. It is a fortified village, perhaps Livonian, perhaps Estonian. Records from the 14th century rarely name such places. They exist on the margins of maps and history. The Hanseatic crew is brought to a longhouse, not arrested, not welcomed, simply held. It is warm, that alone is a kindness. The language of trade. A day passes, then two. A man from the village, a trader or elder, tries to speak with the crew. Latin is tried, then Low German. The master finds one phrase that earns a nod: hands. The Hanseatic League is known here, not always loved but respected. Its cogs bring goods and sometimes trouble, but it is part of the world's rhythm now. The villagers understand that shipwrecks happen. Sometimes survivors are ransomed, sometimes traded, sometimes killed. But this group has no weapons left, no ship to reclaim, no ransom to offer except perhaps their skills. And that may be enough. Barter, shelter, and waiting for snow. Over the next week, a fragile arrangement forms. The crew helps with chopping wood. They mend fishing nets. One of the younger men carves handles for tools. Another teaches the village children how to measure with a knotted rope, useful for both sailing and building. The master watches it all. He rarely speaks now. His job has changed. He is no longer a leader of a voyage. He is a steward of survival. By the second week, the first snow falls. The crew knows they cannot leave. There is no ship to sail, and the Baltic is already beginning to freeze in shallow places. The master approaches the village elder and offers a simple proposal. Spring we go. The elder nods. A winter among strangers. For the next 3 months, the Hanseatic crew becomes part of the village in slow, careful ways. They are given a hut, leaky, smoky, but warmer than trees. They help dig snow trenches, repair fences, sharpen blades with whetstones found in their ship's wreckage. Illness comes and goes. One man dies, buried in frozen earth marked with a carved plank. The crew carves a second one, not out of grief, but to mark that they were here, that they mattered briefly in this place history does not remember. They are not prisoners, but they are not free either. The forest binds them. The storm still holds them in its aftermath. Spring and the return to sea. By late March, the snow recedes. The ground becomes mud. Birds return to the branches. The village elder brings word there is a port several days to the west, a trading post where Hanseatic goods have been seen before. a place where ships may come. The master accepts. He does not expect rescue, but he knows the rhythm of trade. Where salt flows, cogs follow. The crew, what remains of them, prepares for the journey. They have new tunics now made of local wool. They carry walking sticks, not swords. Their coin purses are lighter, but their backs straighter. They survived not through might, but by endurance. A final reflection, lost but not gone. Weeks later, a ship arrives at the western port. A cog, much like the one they lost. Its crew laughs when told the story, not out of mockery but recognition. Storms in the Gulf. Aye, she eats a ship every season. The surviving master books passage back to Lubeck. He has no cargo, no profits, no goods to report. Just names to add to the rolls: those who died, those who lived, and the story of a winter survived by discipline, adaptation, and the quiet will to endure. The voyage ends not with a great battle or glorious rescue, but with men walking home in silence, changed but not erased. In time, their story is forgotten. But the forest remembers. And the sea, she waits. Story 2. Castaways of the White Ship, a royal disaster in the English Channel. You are standing on the pebbled shore of Barfleur, Normandy. It is November 1120. The air is brisk, tinged with salt, but calm, too calm perhaps for what is to come. In the harbor bobs a sleek and splendid vessel, the Blanche-Neuf, the White Ship, the pride of a seasoned fleet. Made from fresh timber and boasting a newly scrubbed hull, the ship is gleaming in the late autumn light. This is no cargo barge or storm-beaten hulk. It is a symbol of royal wealth, manned by 50 hand-picked oarsmen and crewed by the best sailors the Normans could muster. The White Ship is meant to carry a very special passenger across the channel that night. William Adelin, the only legitimate son of King Henry I of England and heir to the English throne. But William is in no hurry. He is 17, proud, confident, and surrounded by fellow nobles his age. His journey has already been delayed once. The sea is calm. And besides, what's the rush? A few barrels of wine are rolled aboard, reportedly paid for in bulk by the prince himself. The crew is granted a portion. So are the knights. And soon the ship becomes less a vessel of state and more of a floating banquet. The political climate, fragile foundations. To understand the importance of what's about to happen, you must understand who William Adelin is. Born in 1103, William is not only the king's son, he is the linchpin of the Norman English realm. His father, Henry I, secured the throne after the mysterious death of his elder brother William Rufus. But Henry's rule, while forceful and cunning, relies heavily on one certainty: that William will continue the dynasty. England in 1120 is a fragile patchwork. The Norman conquest just 54 years earlier is still a living memory. Saxon nobles simmer with resentment. Norman barons crave autonomy. William is meant to bind them. He is married to a daughter of Fulk V of Anjou, a crucial political alliance. His mere survival is of geopolitical importance. And now that future sails in the White Ship with his cousins, half-siblings, and a good portion of the next generation of nobility. An overcrowded, overconfident crew. The ship is sleek, yes, but it is now dangerously full. Contemporary sources suggest that over 300 people may have been aboard, including noblemen, stewards, royal clerks, and crew. Many are intoxicated. Most are young. There are men-at-arms in fine cloaks, ladies in embroidered mantles, and squires eager for favor. Some passengers are illegitimate children of the King Richard of Lincoln, among them. Others are noble sons and daughters whose families would, under normal circumstances, never have allowed them to travel together. But this is not normal. This is a pleasure cruise, wrapped in the illusion of safety. Even the ship's captain, Thomas Fitzstephen, is not just a skilled sailor, he is proud. His father once carried William the Conqueror to England. Thomas boasts that his ship is faster than any other in the Channel. When King Henry departs earlier that day on a different vessel, Thomas offers to race him to England. Henry declines. It is perhaps the most fortunate decision of his reign. The ritual of delay. The sun dips below the waterline, stars begin to appear, the wind is light but favorable. The white ship is finally preparing to leave well after dusk. Most ships would have gone earlier to avoid the treacherous coast in the dark. But the young nobles are in no hurry. More wine is poured, songs are sung. According to chroniclers, the priests sent to bless the voyage are turned away, possibly laughed at. This detail may have been exaggerated by later writers eager to find moral justice in the tale, but it's not hard to believe. The ship is crowded with pride. And not just the pride of youth, but of entitlement. These are the heirs of an empire. They believe, perhaps rightly, that they own the sea. A ship built for daylight, not darkness. When the white ship finally departs under moonlight, it does so with laughter still echoing from the stern. The oars dip in rhythmic precision. The sails are raised to catch what little wind remains. From shore, it looks like a ghost, bright, fast, and vanishing into the horizon. Inside the ship, however, the conditions are far less graceful. The hull is crowded, not built for this many passengers. There are too few lookouts. Most of the crew are drunk. The wine continues to flow. No one is watching the coast as closely as they should. What they don't know, what they can't see in the darkness, is that the coast just outside Barfleur is lined with hidden rocks. Among them, one jagged outcrop known as the Quillabo of rock waits silently beneath the water's surface. The white ship is headed straight for it. The crash. It happens suddenly. A scrape, a crunch, a cry. The hull rips open along its starboard side and icy water floods the hold. Screams erupt, some from fear, some from pain, some from the cold. Barrels tumble, people fall. The ship lurches and begins to capsize. Many are trapped below deck. The windows are too small. The weight of bodies pressing toward the narrow gangways becomes a death trap. Above, the sailors try to cut the lines, but it's too late. The water is already claiming the deck. Prince William is reportedly placed into a small skiff by his bodyguards. He begins rowing toward shore. He might have survived, until he hears his half-sister, Matilda, screaming from the water. He turns back. He never returns. One survivor. Of over 300 people aboard, only one man survives, a butcher from Rouen named Berold. He is not a noble. He does not wear silk or carry a sword. He clings to the wreckage and drifts for hours before being rescued by local fishermen. When asked later what he saw, he says little. The silence speaks louder than the screams ever did. The king learns of his loss. Back in England, King Henry receives the news days later. The chroniclers say he never smiled again. His only legitimate son gone, his nephews gone, his allies' children gone, entire families extinguished in a single night. The dynastic structure he spent his reign building has collapsed into the Channel. In the space of a few hours, England has no clear air. And that will matter more than anyone realizes. The Channel calms again. The waters off Barfleur are calm the next morning. The wreckage of the white ship floats quietly near the rocks, visible to passing boats. Pieces of cloak, the corner of a sail, an oar broken in half. The sea is no longer angry. It never was. It simply doesn't care. But what happens when a kingdom loses its heir? What follows when a single shipwreck unravels a century of royal power? The white ship sinks in November 1120. By December, the English court is plunged into mourning. Yet there is no state funeral, no grand ceremony to mark the loss of a prince, because there is no body. The English Channel swallowed William Adelin whole, along with the better part of the Anglo-Norman next generation. There are no remains, only reports. And in medieval politics, a death without a corpse is only a rumor until enough men say it's true. But it is true, and the consequences of that night will ripple forward for decades. This is not merely a tragedy. It is the first crack in the stone wall of the Norman dynasty in England. A dynasty built on precarious foundations. King Henry I, the fourth son of William the Conqueror, is no stranger to uncertainty. His rise to the throne in 1100 is opportunistic, bordering on opportunism by design. When his elder brother, William II, is struck down in the New Forest under ambiguous circumstances, perhaps a hunting accident, perhaps something more, Henry wastes no time. He seizes the treasury at Winchester and has himself crowned within days. In the following years, Henry proves competent, even ruthless. He defeats his eldest brother Robert Curthose at the Battle of Tinchebray in 1106 and imprisons him for life. He reorganizes the royal administration and strengthens the judiciary, earning the nickname Henry Beauclerk for his scholarly interests. But even the most efficient king must plan for the future. That future was supposed to be William Adelin. With his son gone, Henry faces a problem. There is no clear male heir. His other children are illegitimate, many of them, but bastards do not inherit crowns. Not in the 12th century, not without bloodshed. The question of succession. In the medieval world, succession is not governed by a strict set of laws. It is governed by recognition, allegiance, and the sword. A king's heir must be accepted not only by bloodline but by baronial support. Without it, any claim is as fragile as parchment in a storm. So Henry begins a new plan. He turns to his daughter Matilda. She is the only surviving legitimate child left. At 18, she is already the widow of Emperor Henry V of the Holy Roman Empire, a status that earns her the title Empress, though she no longer rules in Germany. She is clever, she is proud, and she is not easily managed. But she is all Henry has. A realm not ready for a queen. In 1127, 7 years after the White Ship disaster, Henry gathers his nobles and makes them swear an oath. They will recognize Matilda as his heir. Many swear, some sincerely, most out of duty. But oaths made in times of peace are rarely honored in times of crisis, and a female ruler unmarried and imperious is not what the Anglo-Norman barons want, especially when Matilda soon marries Geoffrey Plantagenet, Count of Anjou, a traditional rival to the Normans. It is a political alliance, yes, but an unpopular one. Barons begin to hedge their bets. The cracks left by the White Ship begin to widen. The shadow of Stephen of Blois. Among the survivors of the political world is Stephen of Blois, Henry's nephew and the son of Count Stephen II. Stephen had intended to sail on the White Ship but stepped off at the last moment, complaining of illness. Whether it was fate, wisdom, or luck, it preserved his life and ultimately made him a contender. He is well-liked, charismatic, energetic, not first in line by blood but popular, capable, and most importantly, male. Henry may not trust him fully, but others do. And they are watching. Henry's final years, peace with a deadline. Henry rules for 15 more years after the White Ship disaster. During this time, he works obsessively to secure Matilda's succession, but he never manages to reconcile her haughty demeanor with the politics of a patriarchal realm. His barons nod, bow, and stall. He dies in 1135 reportedly after eating too many lampreys, a favorite dish he was warned against. And within weeks, everything he tried to prevent begins to unravel. The usurpation, Stephen sees of the crown. Matilda is in Anjou when Henry dies. Stephen, ever the opportunist, moves swiftly. He crosses the Channel, reaches London, and has himself crowned king before Matilda even hears the news. Many barons welcome him. He promises stability. He speaks humbly. He is crowned at Westminster in December 1135, barely a month after his uncle's death. The oath sworn to Matilda, forgotten, or remembered only in whispers. But not by Matilda. The anarchy begins. Matilda does not forget the White Ship. She does not forget the oaths. She does not forget her father's plans. In 1139, she invades England with the help of her half-brother, Robert of Gloucester, and begins a campaign to reclaim her throne. The period that follows becomes known, somewhat misleadingly, as the Anarchy. But it is not chaos in the modern sense. It is prolonged civil war, not constant fighting but constant uncertainty. Castles switch hands, fortresses are built then abandoned. Towns are burned, rebuilt, taxed, and taxed again. It is a time of siege more than battle, of famine more than conquest, and it begins not with an army but with a shipwreck. A forgotten detail, the cost to the people. It is easy to follow the crowns and claimants, but for the people living through the anarchy, the legacy of the white ship is far more personal. Trade routes collapse, coinage is debased, local lords seize power from weakened royal officials, justice is inconsistent, food prices spike. Some records describe barons minting their own money, others tell of peasants unable to plant crops for fear of raids. As a chronicler from the time wrote, "Christ and his saints slept." It is not poetic, it is accurate. A war without a sea. Ironically, few battles during the anarchy involve the sea. The white ship, once a proud emblem of English naval confidence, becomes a quiet symbol of what not to do. Ships are treated with more suspicion. Fewer nobles sail at night, and those who do bring their heirs separately. The Channel does not claim another prince, but it claimed the kingdom. Unfinished business. By the end of the 1140s, the war grinds on. Neither side can claim full control. Matilda briefly holds London in 1141, but is forced out after alienating its citizens. Stephen is captured, then released. Robert of Gloucester dies. Matilda returns to Normandy. And though Stephen eventually reclaims his throne, he names Matilda's son, Henry, as his heir. That boy will grow into Henry II, the first of the Plantagenet kings. The crown, it seems, remembers the oaths even if men do not. But how does a civil war end without victory? What legacy does a lost ship leave behind in law, lineage, and legend? By the early 1150s, England has weathered nearly 2 decades of intermittent civil war. Not a single decisive battle has crowned a winner. Not one siege has ended the fight. No treaty has resolved the conflict entirely. And yet, the war is ending not with a fanfare but with attrition. The anarchy, which began with the White Ship disaster and culminated in dynastic warfare between Stephen of Blois and Empress Matilda, is finally exhausting itself. Not because peace was forged, but because everyone is too tired to keep fighting. And beneath the fractured politics lies the unspoken truth. The entire crisis began not with treason or rebellion, but with a shipwreck in the night. A kingdom without anchors. For most of the 1140s, England exists in a limbo state. Neither Stephen nor Matilda can fully govern. Local barons fortify their castles, establish private tolls, and issue their own coinage. The once strong central government of King Henry I meticulously crafted and expanded is reduced to a patchwork of feuding lords and divided loyalties. Chroniclers lament the decay of justice. Even the church, usually a bastion of order, finds itself entangled in the conflict, with bishops taking sides and cathedrals threatened by siege. The people suffer the most. Crop failures, raided towns, and unstable markets reduce much of the population to subsistence and fear. There are no accurate counts of the dead, no casualty lists, no commemorative statues. Yet in a way, it is the ordinary man and woman who bear the long-term wounds of the White Ship's loss. The rise of a new Henry. In 1147, Matilda's teenage son, Henry of Anjou, lands in England with a small mercenary army. It's an ambitious, premature move. He has little real support and even less money. His soldiers are poorly paid, and the campaign fizzles quickly. But Henry does not disappear. He returns to Normandy, where he consolidates power and begins gaining influence in continental politics. By 1153, Henry is no longer a mere claimant's son. He is a serious figure in European affairs, heir not only to Matilda's claim but to Anjou, Maine, and, through marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine, to one of the largest and richest duchies in France. Stephen, now in his 50s, has lost his eldest son Eustace to sudden illness. His health is failing. His hold on the barons is weakening. And worst of all, he knows that many of those around him now believe it is time for a younger man to take the throne. Treaty of Winchester, an unlikely resolution. In late 1153, after some brief skirmishes and a few near battles, both sides agree to meet. The resulting agreement is known as the Treaty of Winchester. Under its terms, Stephen will remain king for the rest of his life, but he will adopt Henry as his heir. It is not a surrender, not a victory, but it is an end. Stephen dies a year later in 1154. Henry becomes King Henry II, the first Plantagenet monarch of England. He is just 21 years old. A new dynasty, forged by absence. Henry II's reign will be long, and it will be hard. He will quarrel with his sons, clash with Thomas Becket, and govern over a realm stretching from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees. But his rule will mark the return of royal authority, the restoration of law, and the beginning of a line of kings that will dominate England for centuries. And yet, none of it was meant to be. Had William Adelin survived the crossing in 1120, Henry II would likely never have become king. The anarchy would never have unfolded. The Plantagenets would never have ruled. It is a strange thing, how absence can shape history more than presence. The legacy of the White Ship. The wreck of the White Ship fades into the mist of legend within a generation, but its legacy survives in quieter ways. One dynastic caution. Medieval monarchs learned to never again place all their heirs on a single ship. Future royal families often travel separately, sometimes in secrecy, to avoid such a repeat. The redundancy of royal succession becomes a priority. 2. Strengthened administration. Ironically, the failure of central government during the anarchy prompts stronger administrative reforms under Henry II. He rebuilds what his grandfather Henry I had created, but better. The common law system begins to evolve. Sheriffs and justices gain clearer roles. The royal exchequer is re-established with firmer oversight. 3. The rise of historical memory. Chroniclers and poets do not forget the White Ship. Wace, Orderic Vitalis, and later writers treat the event with grave solemnity, not as mere accident but as a warning. Pride and indulgence at sea, they suggest, brought down a kingdom. It is not historically precise, but it feels true. The sea as a mirror. In all this, the sea remains unchanged. The English Channel, with its hidden reefs and bitter winds, continues to claim ships for centuries to come. The White Ship was not the first to sink, and it was certainly not the last. But no other shipwreck in the Middle Ages would so thoroughly unravel a royal line, fracture a kingdom, and trigger a civil war that would reshape English governance. It was not a storm. It was not a battle. It was a rock in calm water, struck at night by a ship full of laughter. And in that moment, the crown of England slipped beneath the waves. A quiet ending, a loud consequence. We often look for turning points in history in great speeches, declarations of war, or the coronation of kings. But the truth is often quieter. Sometimes, history changes when a ship sails too late. When too much wine is poured. When one man turns back for a sister's scream. When a prince of England makes a decision not based on policy, but on emotion. We do not know what William Adelin thought in that final moment. But we live in the shadow of the world he never ruled. Story 3, St. Brendan's Storm, the monk who crossed the Atlantic. You wake to the sound of gulls, not dozens, but just one or two, wheeling against the clouds. The sky is heavy, the air wet, and beneath your feet is not a deck of oak or pine, but damp turf. This is not a port, not even a proper harbor, just a crude, uneven cove along the western edge of Kerry, Ireland. The year is somewhere around AD 512, though even the monks who record these things rarely agree on specifics. Standing near the shore, adjusting the folds of his patched woolen robe, is Brendan of Clonfert, a man many will later call Brendan the Navigator, or even Brendan the Voyager. His eyes are narrowed against the sea mist. He's not a young man, perhaps nearing his 40s, and he's not a sailor by trade. He is a monk, a builder of communities, and a man of intense curiosity. He believes, as some early Christians did, that paradise may be found not only in prayer but somewhere out there, across the Western Ocean, where the sun dies each night, where Scripture says waters above and waters below meet, where the world might end or begin again. He has no compass, no charts, no government commission. But he has a plan: to build a boat, gather fellow monks, and sail west in search of the promised land of the saints. Why go west at all? In the 6th century, the Irish monastic movement is already famous for its zeal. Monks leave home not for gain, but for peregrinatio pro Christo, exile for the sake of Christ. The more one suffers, the greater the holiness. To leave Ireland is not abandonment but asceticism, a chosen exile. But Brendan's voyage is more than symbolic. Medieval texts, especially the Navigatio Sancti Brendani, the Voyage of Saint Brendan, describe an actual journey, a multi-year pilgrimage across the Atlantic in search of an earthly paradise. Modern historians are divided. Is it fiction, allegory, early exploration distorted by myth, or is there a kernel of truth, a real voyage remembered in the echoes of embellished tale? For now, we accept what Brendan believed, that something holy lay beyond the horizon, and that it was reachable by sail, by prayer, and by patience. Constructing a boat without time. The vessel Brendan builds is called a curragh, a traditional Irish boat made of a light wooden frame covered with treated oxhide. These boats are designed for coastal travel and fishing, not for open ocean. But Brendan modifies his, adding stiffening ribs, a small mast, and reinforcing the leather hull with a mixture of pitch and animal fat to better resist seawater. It is, by any standard, a miracle of minimalist engineering. The monks travel light. No weapons, no iron, only food for a few weeks, salted fish, barley cakes, dried herbs. They bring manuscripts, wax tablets, and most importantly a reliquary containing holy remains. It is not for protection. It is for grounding should the ship drift spiritually off course. 6 monks join him at first. They pray. They fast. Then, on a morning when the wind is right, they push the boat into the waves and disappear westward. The voyage begins. The early days are almost calm. The curragh moves gently across the Atlantic swells. The monks chant psalms, adjust the sail, and bail water from the hide-lined bilge. The sea is more foreign than frightening. They see birds, jellyfish, and great mats of seaweed that seem to slow the boat. Brendan refers to passages from the Psalms, invoking the sea as dry land and the path through the great waters. But the water is not dry, and the path is uncertain. After several days, the wind dies. They float. They pray. The silence becomes oppressive. A storm arrives. It is in the 2nd week, according to later texts, that the first true storm hits. The wind roars out of the northwest. The sea stacks like mountains. Rain lashes the boat. One monk vomits. Another loses his grip on the bailing scoop and nearly goes overboard. There is no anchor, no keel. The curragh is tossed like a child's toy. But Brendan does not panic. He recites scripture, even as waves crash over his shoulders. His calm holds the crew together more than the oxhide hull ever could. He speaks of Jonah, of Paul in the shipwreck, of Christ calming the storm on the Sea of Galilee. But the storm does not calm. They drift for what may be 3 days. When the sky clears, one monk is silent for hours. He refuses food. He shivers even in sunlight. When Brendan finally asks what's wrong, the monk whispers, "I saw the sky touch the water, and beyond that something not meant for us. Island of birds and floating stones." The monks eventually reach an island, or perhaps a volcanic rock jutting from the sea. It is inhabited not by people, but by thousands of birds, many of them unafraid of human presence. The texts claim the birds sing psalms in choir formation. Brendan says they are the souls of monks who died at sea, turned into winged praise. In reality, it may have been Faroe or Iceland, though we cannot know. They stay for a few days, drying the boat and boiling seaweed. Then they encounter something stranger, a floating island of rock, black, warm, and steaming. One monk leaps off the boat to cook fish over it, but the moment he sets fire to it, the island begins to shake. It is, Brendan says, a sea creature, not land at all. In the texts, it is named Jasconius, a great fish mistaken for an island. In modern terms, it may have been a whale, or it may be symbolic proof that even the seemingly solid world beneath your feet cannot be trusted. A journey defined by waiting. The voyage continues not in a straight line, but in a series of pauses. Brendan and his monks travel for years. Some texts say 7, visiting strange lands with sweet waters, silent monks, talking animals, and fruit trees that never wither. Most scholars agree these are allegorical, not literal. But even allegories have meaning. And the deeper truth remains. Brendan survived years at sea in a hide boat, likely visiting outlying islands far beyond the Irish coast. He is not Columbus, nor Leif Erikson, but in the early medieval mind he is something rarer, a man who sought holiness not in isolation but in navigation. But where did he go? The question that remains, centuries later, is simple. How far did Brendan actually travel? Some scholars argue that the tale is pure metaphor. Others suggest he may have reached as far as Iceland, Greenland, or even the northeastern coasts of North America, long before Viking exploration. A controversial 1970s expedition led by explorer Tim Severin successfully recreated the journey from Ireland to Newfoundland in a leather curragh, showing that such a voyage was at least technically possible. But the historical Brendan left no maps, no records, only a story. One rooted not in conquest but in endurance. Not in discovery but in faith. And not in speed but in waiting for the right tide, the right light, and the right wind. So what happens when a voyage never truly ends? When the sea becomes the sanctuary and the journey itself becomes the home? The sea no longer surprises the monks. They have grown used to the rhythm of wind and wave, the groaning of the boat's frame, the smell of salt-soaked leather and human fatigue. It has been months, perhaps even a year. No one is counting, not precisely. The ocean does not permit tidy record-keeping. St. Brendan, now thinner and grayer, is not the same man who pushed off from the Kerry shore. He still prays, still leads chants, still quotes scripture from memory, but his eyes scan the horizon with a deeper weariness. This voyage is not only one of faith, it is one of survival. The Navigatio Sancti Brendani, the medieval account of his travels, becomes more than a hagiographic tale. It becomes a record of how fragile, stubborn, and strangely methodical medieval seafarers could be. Even in the face of myth, boredom, and hardship, they press on. And now, their leather-clad boat drifts toward places unnamed, and waters uncharted even by legend. A world beyond the known. In Brendan's time, the known world ends at the coasts of Ireland and Britain. Beyond that is the Oceanus, a dark and unknowable abyss described by classical geographers as unnavigable. The ancient Greeks believed it encircled the land like a moat. Medieval minds inherited this image of vast, circular sea, empty, lifeless, and possibly impassable. Yet Brendan has passed into this void. What lies here, according to the accounts, are islands fleeting, mystical, often testing both body and soul. Each one is part of a broader pattern, as though the voyage were a kind of spiritual calendar, a liturgical map marked not by latitude, but by virtue. The island of the silent monks. After weeks of gray weather and poor fishing, Brendan and his monks find an island of stone smooth, wind-worn, and inhabited by monks who speak not at all. They communicate with signs. They offer bread, water, and shelter. They wear clothes of flax, move like shadows, and disappear into low stone buildings at night. Brendan takes this as a test of humility. The silence is oppressive at first until the monks realize how much of their time had been spent filling the voyage with words. In this place, there is nothing to say. They stay for 40 days. When they leave, the island's leader gives them a glowing stone, a symbol perhaps, or an allegory. Light that does not burn, knowledge without voice, illumination without explanation. Historians interpret this passage as a nod to early Christian anchorites, hermits who sought God not in community, but in isolation. To Brendan, however, it proves that holiness can exist anywhere, even on a rock in the Western Sea. Storms without thunder. The next storm is not violent, but vast. No rain, no lightning, just a dense and breathless fog thicker than any they've seen. The sea becomes a mirror, flat, still, and unnervingly silent. The sail is useless. The oars creak when used. Visibility is barely the length of the boat. This storm lasts 3 days. The monks whisper about purgatory, about the biblical outer darkness. Brendan, calm as ever, insists that they must be nearing something sacred. He is not wrong. At dawn on the 4th day, a faint glow appears in the mist ahead. Not fire, not sun, but a dome of golden light, faint as first breath. As they approach, it rises like a mountain from the sea. The promised land of the saints. They have arrived, according to the text, at the island of promise, the very goal of Brendan's voyage. It is described in detail: abundant fruits, rivers of milk and honey, meadows where the air sings. No thorns, no decay, no death. The grass does not yellow. The water is always sweet. They are greeted by a man in white who tells them they may stay for a time but not forever. This is not heaven, not Eden, but a threshold, a taste of divine perfection on earth. Modern readers interpret this as symbolic, a metaphor for spiritual enlightenment, not a physical place. But some historians suggest Brendan may have reached the Azores, or even Madeira Islands, far enough to seem mystical, fertile enough to stun medieval eyes, and remote enough to vanish again from memory. Others go further, suggesting Newfoundland or Nova Scotia, especially in light of the success of Tim Severin's 1976 voyage, which replicated Brendan's journey in a reconstructed leather boat. But for Brendan, geography is beside the point. This place was real because it was earned. The return home. Brendan does not remain in the promised land. The man in white tells him he must return to Ireland, for your time is not yet. The monks do not protest. They gather provisions and depart as they arrived, in a small curragh pushed gently by the tide. Their return journey, as written, is shorter, perhaps symbolic, perhaps real. They stop briefly on familiar islands. Their silence deepens. Their prayers become simpler. When they reach Ireland again, they are almost unrecognizable, thinner, darker, weather-beaten, and calm in a way that unnerves those who greet them. Brendan says little of what he saw. He found what he sought. He shares what he must. The legacy of the journey. Brendan returns to monastic life. He founds churches and abbeys, most notably Clonfert Abbey, which becomes a center of Irish learning for centuries. He continues to teach, guide, and bless. He dies in c. AD 577, old and revered. The Navigatio Sancti Brendani, first written down several centuries later, becomes a medieval bestseller, copied and translated across Europe. It influences Dante, Columbus, and even mapmakers, who place St. Brendan's Isle on charts of the Atlantic well into the 1500s. But the real impact is quieter. Brendan's voyage becomes a model of patient, uncertain exploration, a reminder that not all discoveries require conquest, that some journeys are about finding the limits of one's faith, endurance, and understanding. The world is bigger than the sea. By the 12th century, Brendan is canonized. By the 14th, he is a legend. By the 20th, he is a curiosity. But for those who spend time on the sea, for sailors, monks, and those in between, Brendan remains more than myth. He is a man who looked west not for land to own, but for a world beyond the world. Whether or not he saw North America matters less than the fact that he believed it was there. In the age of information, such belief feels quaint. In the age of storms, it feels brave. But what happens when the sea is no longer a frontier but a memory? What do the monks remember years later, when the waves are gone but the silence remains? Years pass, decades. The monks who once sailed west with Brendan have scattered to other monastic houses. A few remain near him at Clonfert Abbey, quiet and older now, their bodies curved with time and sea-weathered memory. No one talks about the voyage as much anymore, not in public, not in detail. But you can see it in their habits. The way they pause before taking bread. How they study the sky as if it still means direction. How they listen, not just for words but for wind. Brendan himself is a respected abbot. His days are filled with duties overseeing manuscripts, tending to the sick, welcoming pilgrims. But in quiet moments near the fire, young novices sometimes ask, "Father, was it real?" And Brendan, with the faintest smile, might reply, "Which part?" The limits of language. The Navigatio Sancti Brendani, as it eventually comes to be known, is not written by Brendan himself. Most scholars agree it was composed around the 9th century, centuries after Brendan's death, passed down orally, shaped by monastic memory, layered with allegory. But it contains vivid details: sea creatures, strange islands, molten rocks, silent monks, great floating crystals, and sweet-smelling lands of abundance. It's too rich to be entirely made up, too symbolically neat to be entirely factual. In medieval Europe, the boundary between fact and spiritual truth was never hard-edged. For a monk, a real island might exist in the heart, in the Psalms, or just beyond the fog. The monks who copied Brendan's voyage into Latin, and then into Irish, Old French, and Middle English, were not hoaxers. They were preservationists saving something they believed mattered. And what mattered most was not whether the voyage happened in the modern sense, but that someone believed enough to try. When oceans were unknowns. By the 11th century, Brendan's voyage was not unique but foundational. It joined other insular traditions of sea-traveling saints, Malo, Columba, Cuthbert, Macarius. Men who went a sea not to find riches but to withdraw from the world and, paradoxically, to understand it better. Monasteries along Ireland's west coast used Brendan's example to inspire a life of endurance and detachment. Sea exile became a form of penance. To drift was to trust God. To be hungry was to learn dependence. To suffer was to be refined. The sea, for Brendan and his followers, was not a barrier but a teacher. It offered no shelter. It did not flatter. But it told the truth over and over with every shift in wind, every leak in the hull, every passing whale and vanishing shore. Brendan's influence across centuries. The Navigatio didn't vanish into the monastic shelves. It traveled much like Brendan himself. By the 12th century, copies appear in Germany, Italy, and Spain. Pilgrims read it on the road to Santiago. Monks use it as a teaching text. Preachers quote it in sermons. Geoffrey of Monmouth references Brendan's travels when writing about King Arthur's explorations. Later, Columbus himself is said to have read the Navigatio. Some chroniclers claim he used Brendan's voyage as partial justification for sailing west, arguing that land could and had been reached across the Atlantic. This may be apocryphal, but the belief itself matters. By then, maps of the Atlantic start including Brendane's Isle, a phantom land seen by many, verified by none, sometimes drawn off the Azores, other times near the Canaries. It doesn't matter if the island is real. It matters that it stayed on the map for 900 years. Truth hidden in leather and salt. So what do we do with Brendan's story? Modern historians, engineers, and sailors have made sincere efforts to test it. Most notably, Tim Severin in 1976 built a replica curragh based on medieval Irish methods: wooden frame, stitched oxhide, treated with lanolin and pitch. His team successfully sailed from Ireland to Newfoundland, via the Hebrides, Faroes, Iceland, and Greenland. They proved the journey was possible. But proving possibility is not the same as proving truth. There is no hard evidence Brendan reached North America, no artifacts, no carvings, no ruins. Only a story. A well-preserved, widely copied, persistently read story told by generations who never stopped believing that such a voyage could be real. Brendan the Navigator, Brendan the Monk. In the final years of his life, Brendan never styles himself as an explorer. Not a hero, not a prophet. He is simply a servant of Christ, and the sea, he would say, was part of God's creation, just like the land. He teaches that patience matters more than answers. That discovery without humility is useless. That seeing something incredible changes you, but not always in ways others understand. He dies peacefully, surrounded by fellow monks. His burial place is disputed. Some say Clonfert, others Annigdown, still others Ardfert. Fitting, perhaps, that a man who went missing into the sea so often would have multiple resting places. His body stayed in Ireland, but his story crossed oceans. A final silence. The last thing we know of Brendan's voyage is that it ended not with revelation but return. No fanfare, no parade, just monks, worn out and wiser, stepping back onto familiar ground. They say he looked toward the west once more, before entering the abbey gates. Not as a goodbye, but as if listening. Reflection, the faith to drift. St. Brendan's voyage teaches us something unfashionable in modern exploration, that some journeys are not about arrival, that sailing without certainty is not failure, but devotion. His story is not just a religious fable or maritime mystery. It is a blueprint of resilience, of setting out knowing storms will come, of floating knowing land may never appear, of continuing even when the map runs out. And perhaps most importantly, of returning, changed but never finished. Because the sea does not give conclusions, only direction. Story 4, Galleys in the Gale. Venetian merchants surviving the Adriatic. The Adriatic Sea, stretching like a narrow tongue between Italy and the Balkans, is rarely calm except in looks. Its waters sparkle under the sun and shimmer beneath the moonlight. But beneath the surface lies a history of conflict, commerce, and storms. And in the late 13th century, one ship among many prepares to navigate this treacherous corridor not with soldiers, but with goods. You are aboard a Venetian merchant galley, a sleek and powerful vessel leaving port from Zara Zadar around the year 1293, bound for Venice with a cargo of olive oil, timber, and salted fish. The city, once an independent Dalmatian port, has recently been absorbed into the Venetian Republic, and tensions remain. Every trip through the Adriatic is a statement: commerce as diplomacy, commerce as dominion. This galley is manned not by conscripted oarsmen alone, but by a mixture of free men, hired laborers, merchants, and mariners, all under the command of a noble captain, appointed by Venice, and held responsible not just for profit, but for survival. The structure of a merchant galley. Unlike round ships or cogs favored by northern merchants, Venetian galleys are narrow, long, and rowed by dozens of men seated two to a bench. They also carry lateen sails for speed when wind allows, but they are, above all, oared ships, designed to be fast, maneuverable, and dependable in close waters. At full complement, a trading galley might carry 160-plus rowers, mostly hired and often barely paid, 20-30 sailors handling rigging and sails, 10-15 armed guards, trained with crossbows or short swords, merchants or state officials accompanying their cargo. The vessel's cargo is carefully calculated, packed beneath the deck and along the center corridor, leaving just enough space for men to sleep atop the crates. There are no hammocks, no private quarters, no comfort. Every inch of space is used. Meals consist of hardtack, lentils, dried fish, and occasional wine or olive oil. Water is rationed. Sleep comes in turns, in shifts. There is no glamour aboard a trading galley, only grit and order. The politics beneath the waves. Venice does not merely trade in goods, it trades in power. Each merchant galley carries not just spices or wood, but documents of charter, trade agreements, and symbols of state control. In the Adriatic, rival republics like Genoa or Ragusa, modern Dubrovnik, watch closely. Pirate activity is frequent, often unofficially sanctioned by competing city-states. As the galley pulls away from Zara, the captain issues the same warning given for generations. Storms come in wind or arrows, be ready for both. The ship's quartermaster tallies the inventory, signing each crate and barrel with wax seals. Merchants murmur over cargo manifests, arguing about route choices and timing. Everyone knows this journey could take 2 days or 2 weeks, depending on wind, weather, and war. Signs of trouble. The first 2 days are smooth. The sea glitters. The wind is mild. Rowers work in 6-hour shifts, chanting or muttering as the oars rise and fall. The lateen sail is raised and catches just enough breeze to ease the burden. Then the sky darkens not rapidly but ominously. The color turns not gray but brownish purple, a sign known to Adriatic sailors as la capa morta, the dead cloak, an omen of a sirocco storm coming from the Sahara, crossing the Mediterranean and churning the Adriatic into a narrow cauldron. The sail is lowered, the hatches are sealed, the rowers are ordered to rest and eat while they still can. And the captain begins to calculate. Storm strategy, medieval seamanship. In modern eyes, storms are best endured by turning into the wind, dropping anchor, or calling for aid. But for a 13th century merchant galley, options are limited. No radio, no reliable maps, no accurate compass, not widely used in Mediterranean trade until the 14th century. No safe harbor between islands, unless already known. Instead, the captain uses a lead line to measure sea depth, watching for signs of shoals or reefs. The ship's pilot, often a local with years of experience, judges direction by cloud movement, star position when visible, and water color. In a sirocco storm, the goal is not to outrun the wind, but to survive it sideways. The galley cannot sail directly into the wind, and rowing becomes nearly impossible in strong chop. So they do what hundreds of Venetian ships have done before: turn the bow to quarter the waves, reduce sail to near nothing, and allow the ship to drift under control, preserving structural integrity and the lives of the men aboard. Inside the storm. By nightfall, the wind howls like iron scraping across stone. Waves slam the hull with unpredictable rhythm. Below deck, the men bail water constantly. The oar ports are shuttered, but they leak. Salt water pools near the food crates. One of the oil barrels ruptures. The air smells of fish and sickness. A rower vomits from the motion. Another passes out from exhaustion. Still, the watch rotation continues, men bailing, men praying, men pressing cloth to the beams where seams begin to ooze seawater. The captain remains on deck, drenched, clutching the tiller. He will not sleep, not until the wind changes. Islands without names. On the third morning, the storm begins to weaken, but visibility is poor. Through a haze of sea spray, a cluster of low, rocky islands appears off the port side. They could be sanctuary or shipwreck. The pilot insists he knows them. Perhaps part of the Cornati archipelago, a labyrinth of over 100 tiny islets, most uninhabited, many unnamed on maps of the time. The galley creeps forward, rowers straining to maneuver the bow into a calm inlet. The rocks are close, barnacle-encrusted. One wrong stroke and the galley will split like a reed. But they make it, waiting for the Adriatic to breathe. The crew anchors using stone-weighted ropes. They spread soaked sails over rocks to dry. They boil seawater with coals, catching condensation for drinking. They catch crabs in the shallows, set nets for fish, and pray for the wind to shift. For 3 days, they remain trapped in the inlet. There is no storm now, but the sea remains angry. Venetian galleys, though powerful, are not oceanic vessels. They are made for quick turns, for harbor races, for shallow loading. They do not endure idle time well. The timbers swell. Mold creeps into grain stores. Tempers rise. A dispute breaks out between two merchants over damaged cargo. One accuses the other of poor packing. The captain intervenes with a blunt solution. Argue later. If the sea takes us, it takes both your fortunes. A narrow escape. On the 6th day, the wind returns from the north, cool, dry, and favorable. The crew boards quickly. Rowers take their positions. The galley slips between the rocks and returns to open water, its hull scarred but intact. By the 8th day, Venice appears on the horizon, its campaniles rising like teeth from the mist. They are late, they have lost profit, but they have survived. The lagoon is calm as the galley approaches Venice. The city rises from the sea like a myth made permanent, stone towers and shimmering canals, wooden pilings sunk deep into silt and history. But the returning crew doesn't gaze in awe. They are exhausted. Every plank creaks with fatigue. The cargo is wet, dented, partially spoiled. Still, the galley is intact. That alone is a victory. As they pass through the Lido Inlet, smaller craft pull alongside inspectors, port clerks, curious onlookers. Men with wax tablets, city livery, and sharp questions. Every arrival is a matter of record, especially now with storms reported across the Adriatic. The moment the ship is moored at the Arsenale, the great shipyard and naval base, the Venetian state begins its inspection. Because in the Republic of Venice, every merchant voyage is a matter of public interest. The Venetian state as overseer of commerce. Venice, in the 13th century, is not merely a city, it is a carefully balanced maritime machine. The government maintains a tight grip on trade, especially over the galleys in the state-run merchant fleet. These ships are part of the MUTA system, state-organized convoys that rotate through trade destinations like Alexandria, Constantinople, or London. Even private merchants must lease space on government-assigned vessels or follow state rules. The returning galley from Zara, though smaller than the Grand International Mude, still operates under this system. Upon docking, the cargo is inventoried. A report is filed on any delays, losses, or damage. The captain's log is reviewed, names, hours, days at sea. Tax assessors calculate duties owed, even on damaged goods. It is not personal, it is Venice. Storm damage and bureaucratic delay. The storm has bruised more than the hull. Several barrels of olive oil are found to be leaking, the oak staves warped from seawater. The salted fish has spoiled in places. 2 crates of Dalmatian timber, originally tightly bound and marked for a merchant guild in San Polo, have shifted and cracked. Worse still, one merchant files a formal complaint. He claims the storm delay cost him a key contract. He accuses the ship's captain of reckless routing and inadequate pre-storm preparation. An inquiry is scheduled, not dramatic, just slow. In Venice, reputation is currency, and bureaucracy is a weapon as much as a safeguard. The captain, a man named Marco Ziani, is called before a magistrate. He presents his logbook, weather accounts, and the names of 3 crewmen who can confirm the timing of the squall. He cites an old law: no man shall be held liable for delay due to force of sea, if due caution be shown. The matter is tabled, but the merchant's complaint lingers like damp rot. Crew aftermath: wages, illness, and silence. The crew disperses. Rowers are paid by the oar, not by the hour. Many receive partial wages due to lost cargo or shortened contracts. A few are sick with what seems like sea fever, likely caused by infected wounds and constant dampness. There is no doctor, only a barber surgeon with boiling cloths and vinegar. 2 men disappear from the docks entirely, perhaps to find wine, perhaps to find home. The sailors, those who handled the sail, ropes, and anchor, fare better. They are paid in silver coins, enough to feed a family for a few weeks. None of them ask about the next voyage. But they all know, when the arsenal bell rings again, they'll likely return. Because this is what Venetian maritime life offers: risk, regulation, repetition. Cargo loss versus cargo meaning. Among the most impacted merchants is a young trader named Pietro Baschio. This was his first venture, a partnership with his uncle in Rialto. He had invested in Dalmatian olive oil, hoping to sell it during La Festa della Salute, a city-wide celebration where demand spikes. But the oil is partially ruined, the barrels warped by saltwater and time. He stands on the dock, inspecting each container. He counts 5 usable, 6 questionable, 3 completely spoiled. A small disaster. Yet when a senior merchant passes and hears his grumbling, he laughs and says, "You lost barrels, others lost ships." Perspective in the Adriatic comes in waves. The quiet reality of merchant storms. This voyage is not famous. It will not be recorded in chronicles. There were no pirates, no deaths, no acts of heroism, just loss waiting repair. But that is what most storms in maritime history are: boring, bureaucratic struggles for salvage. Hundreds of ships throughout the Middle Ages endured similar gales in the Adriatic and Mediterranean. They did not disappear. They limped into port, wet, slow, and half-empty. And each one became part of the city's economy, not only in goods, but in stories, legal hearings, insurance assessments, and informal gossip. Survival itself was a form of commerce. Insurance, letters, and recovery. Venice in the 13th century is also experimenting with proto-insurance contracts. Wealthy merchants, leery of losing everything in one voyage, invest in shared cargo pools and diversified routes. After the Zara galley returns, several merchants meet in the Scuola Grande di San Giovanni Evangelista, a lay brotherhood hall, to discuss compensation. No formal insurers exist yet, but they draw up notarized letters pledging compensation if loss exceeds 40%. It is the beginning of what will, in later centuries, become maritime insurance law. The ship's damage, too, becomes useful. Apprentice shipbuilders at the arsenal inspect the cracked planks and warped beams. They note where the oak buckled, how the pitch loosened, how the oarlocks handled wave stress. Venice learns from every ship, every mistake. And yet they prepare again. Within 2 weeks, the galley is reloaded. New cargo, new crew, a different route this time to Ancona. The same ship that nearly broke apart on hidden rocks will soon slip away again at dawn, oars sliding into the water, sail luffing gently, heading south past islands that hold old secrets. No one speaks of the storm now, not really. Because the Adriatic always keeps its own account. What happens when a city builds its power not through conquest, but through repetition, weathering storm after storm until even the sea yields profit? In the shadowed chambers of the Doge's palace, marble pillars echo with quiet footsteps. Here, Surrounded by stone lions, gilded ceilings, and the smell of wax and parchment, the machinery of Venice continues to turn, not in bursts of drama, but in calculated, cautious increments. The storm that struck the galley from Zara has long since passed. The sea has forgotten. The wind has turned. But in Venetian ledgers, in port manifests, and in court records it endures. Because in this city of canals, a storm is never just weather. It is an entry in a book, a question of loss, a calculation of risk, a negotiation between fortune and law. And every decision made, every lira paid, every crate examined, every contract amended is part of a centuries-long survival strategy. Venice and the culture of maritime memory. Unlike kingdoms ruled by land wars and feudal oaths, Venice is a republic built on memory. Its true borders are roots, not walls. Its history is recorded not in battle songs, but in shipping logs and merchant diaries. When a galley survives a storm, the knowledge is preserved. Where the waves broke hardest, how the hull responded to prolonged pressure, which cargo types withstood damp better than others, which crews returned intact, and which captains lost the least. These details are copied, discussed, and quietly shared among merchant families and shipbuilders. They become a collective resilience, a sea-based culture of adaptive pragmatism. Venetians do not romanticize storms. They price them, the human cost that isn't counted. While merchants argue over wine rot and oil barrel refunds, the rowers and sailors who endured the Adriatic squall have mostly scattered. Some have taken new contracts, others lie in infirmaries, a few may never work again. But their names don't appear in the public records, not in the way cargo does. Rowers are workers for hire, often poor men from the Venetian terra firma or the Dalmatian coast. They sign contracts for a season, sometimes for single voyages. They are paid little, fed just enough, and replaced when needed. Their role in surviving a storm is often overlooked. And yet, without them, the ship would have gone under. In rare cases, a captain might mention a particular oarsman or helmsman who distinguished himself during a storm. Perhaps a man who held the rudder while others fell back, a rower who kept his bench partner alive. These mentions are brief footnotes in a world ruled by ink and ownership. But they are there. And that matters. When loss becomes regulation. Following the near disaster, the Great Council of Venice convenes a brief session to review storm-related reports from multiple galleys that returned late that month. It is not a dramatic affair, no banners, no debates. Just a few noblemen, clerks, and legal advisors reviewing recommendations. From these meetings, new maritime ordinances quietly emerge. Cargo capacity per ship is reduced by a fraction during the storm season. Ship captains are now required to file a pre-departure wind assessment, signed by the local port pilot. The arsenal is ordered to test a new method of pitch binding to resist prolonged dampness. No one announces these changes to the public. They are inserted into statutes, distributed to shipbuilders, posted in port offices. And just like that, Venice adjusts, quietly, permanently. The galley sails again. The same galley that nearly cracked on the Cornati rocks is soon repaired. The hull is reinforced. The damaged benches are replaced. The figurehead is repainted, this time with a faint line of blue waves beneath the lion of St. Mark. The new cargo is less volatile: textiles, ceramic wares, and dried beans. The route is simpler: Venice to Ancona and back, with 2 stops on the Istrian coast. The crew is different. A few familiar faces remain, but most have rotated out. One former rower now works at the shipyard. Another has joined a small coastal patrol, hunting pirates between Hvar and Rab. But the ship is still the same. And it still bears the name that no one ever speaks aloud, a name too long, too formal, listed only in official charters. The crew simply calls her La Sopravvissuta, the survivor. The Adriatic, a sea of repetition. Unlike the wide Atlantic or the open Mediterranean, the Adriatic is intimate. Narrow, rocky, and dotted with islands, it creates patterns of storm and silence. Merchant ships know when the wind turns, when the fog comes, where the reefs sit beneath calm water. But knowledge does not guarantee safety. It merely offers a better bet. And Venice-wise, Venice plays the odds. Each galley is a calculated risk. Each storm a reminder that resilience is not found in strength but in habit, in discipline, in preparation. And most of all, in the ability to continue. Not in spite of storms, but because of them. A final ledger entry. Weeks after the galley's return, the last bureaucratic note is filed in the Camera degli Imprestiti, the office responsible for recording maritime loans and losses. Zara Galley 1293, delay due to weather, partial cargo lost, hull repaired, captain cleared, route continues. That's it. No poetry, no recognition of the storm, no memory of the panic, the rain, the screaming oarlocks or prayers whispered over slick decks. Just another line. Because in Venice, survival is not exceptional. It is expected. Story 5. The final voyage of the Ormen Lange, Vikings and the North Atlantic Fury. The North Atlantic swells under a cold gray sky, its surface a heaving wilderness of slate-colored water. Wind drives salt into the eyes. Gulls do not fly this far. Even the waves sound different here, heavier, older. It is the year 1025, late autumn. The sun rides low and daylight grows shorter with each passing day. You are aboard the Ormen Lange, or Long Serpent, one of the last great longships of the Viking Age. She is not a trade ship, not a fishing vessel. She is a symbol, a masterpiece of Norse shipbuilding. A sleek, ornate warship nearly 30 meters long, her prow carved into the shape of a twisting serpent, its wooden scales painted with ochre and soot. But this is not a war raid. The Ormen Lange is sailing home from Greenland, some say, or perhaps Vinland. The records, such as they are, speak little of the crew's purpose and more of the voyage's end. This will be her final crossing, whether anyone knows it or not. The design of power. The Ormen Lange is built for speed and intimidation. Like other Viking longships, she has a shallow draft able to glide through coastal shallows and deep ocean alike. She can be rowed by up to 60 oarsmen, or sailed with a single square sail of wool reinforced with leather. Her ribs are made of bent oak, her planks tight-joined and caulked with tar-soaked animal hair. Inside, there are no cabins, no galley, no central hold. Just space for men, weapons, and provisions, tucked under cowhide tarps and wrapped in linen. Navigation is done by sunstone, by bird flight, and by long memory passed down from one helmsman to the next. There is no compass, no map, only experience. And this far north, experience means little when the wind decides to turn. Why they were sailing at all. Viking voyages of this era are not simple raids. By the early 11th century, many Norse expeditions are settlement missions, trade runs, or diplomatic journeys. Greenland has been colonized for a generation. Rumors of Vinland farther west have spread from Leif Erikson's expeditions, but the Atlantic is indifferent to plans. This crew, perhaps 40 men and a few thralls, are returning to Norway, likely to Trondelag or the coast near Nidaros, modern Trondheim. Their ship carries timber, hides, perhaps even wine casks or walrus ivory. Not much, but enough to justify the trip. It is late in the year, too late by wiser standards. But they push on, because winter at sea may be deadly. But winter on land, far from home, with dwindling supplies is no better. The first signs of the storm. It begins with silence. Not calm, not peace. A sudden unnatural flatness to the air. The wind drops. The water grows oddly still. A pale haze spreads across the horizon. The helmsman frowns and spits into the sea. This is a sign of weather turning not in an hour but in minutes. The men begin tightening ropes, securing their gear, and donning heavy cloaks of wool and fur. The sail is lowered. Oars are shipped. They will try to ride it out, as generations have done before. The longship in the storm. Viking ships, for all their reputation, are vulnerable in open ocean during storms. Their design favors speed and agility, not endurance. When the storm strikes, it does so with a blunt, unrelenting force. Snow lashes horizontally. Wind howls across the deck, tearing at cloaks and limbs. The serpent-headed prow smashes into oncoming waves with a sound like bones cracking. The men bail water with carved wooden scoops, passing buckets hand to hand in a grim rhythm. They do not cry out. Vikings are trained for hardship. But training cannot stop a mast from snapping. The mast goes. It is not a moment but a slow-motion tragedy. The sail twists, the ropes strain, and then, with a wooden groan that seems to echo from the sea itself, the mast gives way. The boom smashes across the port side, catching two men off guard. One is thrown into the sea. The other lands hard against the rowing bench and does not rise. The broken mast dangles, dragging in the water. The crew fights to cut it free before it pulls the ship sideways. They succeed, but the ship is now rudderless, powerless, and adrift. The cold that creeps in. Water is everywhere, in boots, in wool, in the joints of the ship. Hands go numb. Breath steams in the dark. One man begins to shake uncontrollably. Another stops responding. Hypothermia, though they don't know the term, is setting in. The storm has passed, but the sea remains rough and the sky is featureless gray. They have no sail. They have no birds to follow. The sun is gone. Only the North Star remains, faint and pale. They are adrift in cold salt water, days from land. And supplies are running low. Survival in Viking practice. Viking crews, especially those making Atlantic crossings, train for these moments. They bring seal oil for waterproofing and light, dried fish and barley bread wrapped in waxed linen, skins of mead or fermented milk, both sustenance and morale, spare wood and nails, packed in grease to prevent swelling. But none of it matters without direction. The sea does not carry them east. It pushes them north toward unknown ice. They have no harbor to aim for. Only a decision to make. Try to row toward the sun when it returns, or drift and wait for rescue. They choose to row. And they row for 2 days, stopping only to eat, bail, and sleep in turns. No one speaks of the man swept overboard. The cold has sealed that chapter. Landfall or not. On the 3rd day, someone sees darkness on the horizon, a broken line against the sky. Land. But the currents are strong. Ice floats in the water, now thick, irregular, silent. The ship strikes one and bounces, the hull creaking. Another hits the stern. A third smashes the oar on starboard side. It becomes clear they will not make it. The crew decides to anchor, using stone weights and rope. They hope to rest, reassess, perhaps light a fire on the deck in an iron pot. But the rope snaps in the night, and the oarman Lange begins to drift again silently, slowly, back into the open sea. The helmsman, a man known only in the sagas as Kettle Flatnose, wraps himself in a woolen blanket and says nothing. The men understand. This voyage is no longer about returning. It is about enduring. What happens when a legendary ship becomes a coffin of salt and oak, and when survival becomes a choice between direction and acceptance? The sea is no longer violent. It is worse, it is indifferent. After the mast broke and the anchor failed, the oarman Lange drifts farther from the coastlines the crew once knew. The violent swells have softened, replaced by a steady, icy roll that never stops. There is no sight of land, no flocks of birds, no floating logs. The sky is a uniform dull white during the day, and the stars when visible are smeared by cloud and cold air. You are still aboard. The longship has become a kind of floating graveyard for purpose, direction, and the last warmth of the known world. And yet no one gives up, not in the way you'd expect. Vikings did not define survival by comfort. Endurance itself was an act of loyalty to kin, to gods, to memory. Routine in the absence of hope. With no sail and little ability to row without strength, the men begin to establish routines, not because it helps them survive, but because it gives shape to time. Morning, light the iron brazier, if it can be done. Attempt to boil seawater for condensation. Midday, eat half a strip of dried fish. Chew bark to keep saliva moving. Scrape ice from sides of the ship. Evening, rotate sleeping rolls. Check for frostbite. Chant sagas aloud. They take turns reading, or rather reciting, from runic charms scratched into sticks or bits of bone. Not spells exactly, but reminders of lineage, lines from sagas or myths that preserve one's name against the cold. One such chant is repeated often. May our bones be found beneath stars, and not beneath silence. It is not from Eddaic verse, it is crew-made, and that somehow makes it more sacred. The first death acknowledged. On the 5th day of drifting, one of the rowers, Bjorn Hunsen, does not wake up. There is no shock, only quiet. His blanket is lifted, his skin is pale and tight. His hands are curled into fists, but gently. No one weeps. There are no priests, but there is ritual. The men wash his body with melted snow, wrap him in a linen shroud. They whisper his father's name 3 times and his mother's name once. A single silver coin is placed under his tongue. The captain orders his body lowered into the sea, not burned. Fire would waste precious oil, and besides, the waves now feel like the more honest grave. The crew makes no mention of the next man likely to die. But they all know the limits of Norse medicine. There is no healer on board, but in Viking tradition, sailors knew enough to tend to wounds and illnesses in theory. In practice, they have only tar and animal fat to close wounds, scraps of willow bark for pain, mead diluted by melted snow to dull fear. When a second man develops a hacking cough and shivers uncontrollably, they make him a bed of sailcloth, surround him with warm stones, and feed him warm water spoon by spoon. He survives barely, but he loses the feeling in his legs. And he stops speaking after that. An island appears and vanishes. On the 7th morning, one of the younger crew cries out, "Land." It's a dark shape on the horizon, too jagged to be cloud. They wake the captain. The few men with strength pick up the oars. The ship creaks forward. But after 2 hours, the land seems no closer. After 5, it fades behind fog. A mirage, a mistake, or simply an island they could not reach in time. One man breaks down just briefly. He throws a piece of wood overboard and curses Odin for showing what cannot be touched. The others say nothing. When silence returns, the only sound is the creak of the wood and the breath of the sea. A story that survives somehow. What happens next is not entirely known. The Ormen Lange does not appear again in Norse records. Its name is absent from the Icelandic sagas that follow. No burial mound is built for its captain. No stone rune records the crew. But parts of the story surface elsewhere. In a 12th century Icelandic saga, a passage refers obliquely to the serpent ship that sailed into ice and silence. In a Greenland church inventory from 1130, a wooden cross is recorded with the name Ketil carved into it, along with the faint image of a serpent curled into a circle. In a folk story collected in 14th century Norway, sailors tell of a ghost ship seen in fog, its carved prow just visible before it fades again. A longship that never turns back, even in calm water. None of these prove anything, but they suggest something. The memory of the Ormen Lange did not vanish. It floated like wreckage through time. A ship as a symbol. The Viking Age would not last much longer. By the end of the 11th century, longships give way to rounder trading vessels. Norse kings embrace Christianity. Sagas are written down rather than spoken aloud. Raids slow. Colonies struggle. But the longship remains a symbol, not of plunder, but of movement against odds. The Ormen Lange, if it truly did vanish in the North Atlantic, was not defeated by war, nor by betrayal. It was lost to the same force that shapes all true endurance stories: weather, fatigue, and the simple cruelty of time. The sea holds what we forget. The North Atlantic does not remember the ship. The waves that took it have changed 1,000 times. The ice that scraped its hull has melted and reformed. Even the stars have shifted their positions by imperceptible degrees. But in the minds of those who go to sea, the idea remains. A ship, too far out, too late in the season, holding together for just a few more days than expected. And what if survival means not rescue but being remembered at all? What happens when a ship's true victory is that it left no bones, but left behind belief? By now, the Ormen Lange has drifted beyond any shore her crew could name. The men aboard have lost count of days. Their shadows have thinned, their cheeks hollowed. The longship itself, once glorious and proud with its serpent prow, has become a sodden ark, a container of tired souls and cracked timber. The storm has passed. The sea is calmer now, almost eerily so. But the silence that follows hardship is not peace. It is the hum of waiting, the death of purpose. There is an unspoken truth in all long journeys. When the original reason is lost, when destination, mission, or glory dissolves, what remains is the ritual of movement. The crew rows not to escape, but because rowing is all they know. They bail water, even if it no longer threatens the ship. They chant softly in the dark verses from sagas, lines from old kennings, fragments of tales learned in youth, not to summon courage but to mark the hours. Bragi, the skald among them, speaks the least now, but when he does, his voice is dry and quiet. Even the gods cannot row against the tide forever. He says this with no anger, just understanding. The captain's final choice. Kettle Flatnose, the ship's helmsman and captain, has not left his post. Through blizzards, sleet, and sunless days, he has remained near the tiller, though it no longer turns them toward anything. He still watches the horizon. On what the men believe to be the 15th day adrift, Kettle calls the crew to the center of the ship. All who can still stand gather. A few are supported by others. One man is carried. Kettle makes no speech. Norse captains are not known for ceremony. Instead, he pulls a carved piece of whalebone from a pouch beneath his cloak. On it is a map, not of the coastlines, but of a constellation the stars used in summer crossings from Iceland to Norway. He holds it up to the gray sky. And then, as if in defiance, he tosses it overboard. "We are past the stars now," he says. No one protests. They know. This is the end of the voyage. Not death, not yet, but a shift, from travel to conclusion. The longship as tomb. In the Norse tradition, warriors are often buried in ships real or symbolic. Mounds are built over their hulls. Goods are laid at their feet. Fire consumes the remains. Sails are turned into shrouds. But the Ormen Lange has no mound, no stone circle, no priest or skald to recite rites. Still, it becomes a ship burial, only not in the ground, but in motion. The men, one by one, lie down beside the crates. The masts stump the coiled lines. They sleep, they wake, they whisper. One dies quietly. The others do not bury him this time. They simply cover him with wool and let him rest beside the rest. And then ashore. On the 20th day, perhaps longer, someone sees birds, not gulls, but sea crows, which seldom fly more than 20 miles from land. Then kelp, then logs, then a distant smell, smoke would smoke. No one dares speak hope aloud. But they begin to row again. And this time the sea answers. By dusk, the ship enters a narrow inlet flanked by cliffs. A curl of smoke rises from the tree line. A stone marker sits just above the surf. Carved into it, faint and moss-covered, a runic R, not for religion but for a name, a place, a claim. They are home. What becomes of the Orman land? The ship is pulled ashore. Barely, her ribs are bowed, her seams weep tar, she is no longer seaworthy. The remaining men, perhaps a dozen, are helped ashore by fisherfolk from a nearby settlement. They are recognized, eventually. They are fed, clothed, allowed to sleep in longhouses where the fire never dies. One dies within the week, his body too broken to recover. Another disappears into the woods. The rest return slowly, carefully to Trondelag, to scattered farms and forgotten debts. Kettle, the captain, is said to have never taken ship again. He becomes a carver of wood. He dies in his 70s, his hands gnarled, his back bent, and his eyes still scanning the horizon. The Orman's legacy. The longship is never rebuilt. Instead, the locals haul her onto the shore, upside down, and turn her into a shelter for nets and fishing tools. Children play beneath her dragon-shaped prow. Old men tell stories on her bench boards. She becomes a living artifact not in a museum, but in the landscape. And eventually, the sea reclaims her. Bit by bit, plank by plank, until all that remains is the memory of her shape and the story of the crew who came back when they should not have. What the sagas leave out. The great Icelandic sagas speak of vengeance, glory, and heroic death. But this story, the drifting, the silence, the frost-bitten fingers and long waits, is largely absent from them. It is too slow, too ordinary, too boring, some might say. But for historians, for sailors, for the people who endure rather than conquer, these are the stories that matter most. Because most men did not die with a sword in hand. They died bailing water, rowing toward hope, freezing beside barrels of fish, holding on a few hours longer than expected. This was the final voyage of the Orman Lange. And for all its hardship, it was never a failure. It reached its shore. A quiet reflection. In the end, the sea does not punish or reward. It simply waits. And sometimes, just sometimes, it gives back what it tried to take. Story 6. Aboard the Mater de Deus, Storms and Survival in the Spice Trade. The ocean off the Azores lies still, almost smug, as if it knows what's coming. The air is thick, windless, and heavy with heat. The year is 1592, and floating in these unnervingly calm waters is one of the most extraordinary ships to ever sail out of the East. The Mater de Deus, Mother of God, a Portuguese carrack more akin to a floating warehouse than a ship. She is not sleek, she is not elegant, but she is enormous, over 1,600 tons, towering 7 decks high, carrying more than 500 men, and packed to the brim with a fortune so vast that even the pirates circling her can barely believe it exists. Spices, jewels, silks, dyes, musk, gold, silver, ebony, porcelain. But it is not war or greed that will nearly destroy the Mater de Deus. It is the ocean itself. Aboard this great vessel, heavy, creaking, and overburdened with treasure, the storm will not come as a crashing wave, but as a slow suffocation by weight, salt, and time. The root of riches. The Mater de Deus departed Goa, India, months earlier, part of the Portuguese India Armada, returning home with the wealth of the East Indies. Her voyage is carefully timed, meant to follow the monsoon winds westward across the Indian Ocean, around the Cape of Good Hope, and then northward through the South and Central Atlantic toward Lisbon. It is a well-known route. Many ships have made it, but none so heavy as this one. She is not just full, she is overloaded beyond safe limits, Barrels of nutmeg are stored in hallways. Bales of silk are stuffed into cabins. The decks themselves sag under the weight of ivory, camphor, cinnamon, and carved jade. One sailor jokes that if they reach Lisbon without sinking, it will be because God wanted the loot to arrive intact. No one laughs very long. Design and danger. The Mater de Deus is a carrack, a type of ship evolved from the earlier round-hulled naus that carried Portugal's maritime empire across half the world. She is built for capacity, not combat. Her high fore and aft castles make her top-heavy. Her rigging is complex. Her draft is deep. When fully loaded, as she is now, her waterline nearly brushes the scuppers. A hard wave over the bow could swamp the deck before it drains. A sudden shift in cargo could capsize her. A burst plank could mean a slow, grinding death by flooding. She is a ship meant to carry too much, too far. And she is not built for storms. The men below deck. Life aboard is not grand, even on a ship of riches. The lower decks are sweltering, the air thick with spice dust, sweat, and the odor of rotting fruit. Many of the sailors are suffering from scurvy, their gums bleeding, their legs weak. There is little fresh water left. The voyage has taken longer than expected after a becalmed stretch off the Cape. The officers eat better salted meat, dried peas, and preserved citrus when available, but they too suffer from fatigue and monotony. Navigation is done with astrolabe and dead reckoning. Latitude can be estimated, but longitude is a mystery. The pilot fears they've drifted too far west. Others whisper they are nearing the Azores, where English privateers have been known to prowl. They are not wrong. But for now, the true enemy is not steel or cannon. It is salt and saturation. Leaks and list. A week into the North Atlantic leg, the ship begins to list a lean so subtle at first that many dismiss it as wind pressure. But by the third day, it becomes impossible to ignore. Barrels roll. Men slide on the sloped deck. Water sloshes unevenly in the bilge. The carpenter is summoned. He finds what everyone feared. The hull is opening, slowly, relentlessly. The seams, stressed by overloading, have begun to warp outward. Tar has dried. The oak planks, expanded and contracted over months at sea, no longer fit perfectly. And now, at this crucial point, laden with a kingdom's worth of cargo, the Mater de Deus begins to take on water. The bilge pumps run constantly. Crews are assigned in rotating shifts. Men shovel water with buckets. Barrels are rearranged. Lighter cargo is thrown overboard. Cheap timber, bricks of tamarind, even some of the cotton cloth bales. Still, the list remains. The ship has survived storms before, but never with this weight. A storm without wind. As if mocking them, the sea remains calm. No towering waves. No gales, just the persistent presence of pressure, the unbearable mass of the ship's own wealth pressing downward, grinding its bones apart. The officers discuss drastic measures, throwing cannon overboard, jettisoning lower deck cargo, even scuttling and transferring to lifeboats if land is spotted. But such suggestions are met with resistance. You would throw the Queen's treasure into the sea. Better than sinking with it. The arguments go unresolved, because before they can act, the English arrive. Enemy sails. On August 3rd, 1592, just east of Flores in the Azores, the damaged, leaking, and dangerously overweight Mater de Deus is spotted by an English fleet under Sir John Burruff, sailing under the orders of Walter Raleigh and Queen Elizabeth I. The Portuguese ship cannot maneuver. She cannot run. Her cannons are rusted, buried behind barrels, and many have not been fired in months. Still, her commander tries. But the English open fire from smaller, faster vessels. Grappling hooks are thrown. The carrack's sterncastle becomes a scene of smoke, shouting, and confusion. Some Portuguese sailors throw down their weapons. Others are cut down. Within hours, the largest prize ever taken on the open sea is in English hands. And yet, even with the threat of death past, the true danger remains. The ship is still sinking. A race against water. Now in English hands, the crew must find a way to keep her afloat long enough to tow her to England. Even in victory, the fight turns back to buckets and bracing. Pumps run night and day. Cargo is hastily inventoried. Some spices are soaked. Others, clove, nutmeg, cinnamon, remain dry, miraculously sealed in wax packets. The new crew estimates they have weeks, maybe days, to reach safe harbor before the ship collapses under her own weight. They do not try to repair her fully. They simply try to prevent her from dying before they get her home. And so she crawls east. The Mater de Deus, Mother of God, is dragged slowly, painfully toward the English coast. She arrives in Dartmouth, barely upright, leaking from every seam. By then, sailors and thieves have already begun to strip her, even while she floats at anchor. Jewel boxes vanish. Rare books disappear. Gold dust is found in the folds of clothes. Officials estimate that half her value disappears before the hold is even counted. But what remains is staggering. What happens when a ship becomes too heavy to survive, when greed becomes ballast, and the ocean punishes not with fury, but with slow, certain weight? The harbor at Dartmouth in late August 1592 is a frenzy of movement. Carts creak under the weight of musk and myrrh, chests of pearls and ambergris, and bales of silk hauled off the slowly dying hulk of the Mater de Deus. The ship that drifted halfway around the world now lies at anchor, her hull leaking steadily into the salt water she once defied. She did not sink in the open sea. She is sinking here, quietly, among the warehouses and dockworkers of an English port. And though no waves crash over her decks now, the crew, merchants, and scavengers aboard know this is not safety. It is merely another kind of storm. What the Mater de Deus carried. By the time the carrack was captured, her cargo had already begun to rot from within. There were 550 tons of pepper, packed in sacks, many of which had burst open during the crossing, coating the lower decks in a pungent layer of spice dust. 400 tons of cloves, cinnamon, and nutmeg, sealed in wax or tarred cloth, still valuable. 14 chests of gold and silver coins, mostly Spanish, minted in Peru and New Spain. Loose emeralds, rubies, and pearls, sewn into hems or hidden in false bottom crates. Fine Indian textiles, many now moldy and moth-eaten from damp exposure. Logs of ebony and sandalwood, warped from swelling planks pressing against each other in the heat. This was not just wealth, it was evidence of the Portuguese Empire's reach, compressed into a single, creaking hull. And the English, stunned by the sheer volume, had no infrastructure prepared to process it. A ship under siege again. The Mater de Deus, though captured, quickly became the site of internal looting, not by enemies, but by opportunistic allies. Dock workers, local merchants, even officials began to sample the cargo. Items vanished from inventories. Ledgers were rewritten. The English crown, realizing it was losing half the treasure before it reached the treasury, sent Sir Walter Raleigh to take control of the ship. He arrived to find a wreck in progress. Sailors drunk on stolen wine from the hold. Gems traded in taverns for pennies. Silks used as rags by dockhands, unaware of their value. Raleigh wrote, "I never saw greater confusion, the spoil being so great, and no man able to take notice or stay the tumult." But the real damage had already been done. Because while men squabbled over cloves and coins, the sea continued to pry the ship apart. Salt and timber. The Atlantic saltwater, soaked deep into every seam of the carrack during her crossing, now turns her wood soft and black. Barnacles cling to her rudder. The pitch between planks peels away in the late summer heat. Inside the hull, the lower decks are no longer dry. Pepper has absorbed moisture and begun to ferment. Rats scurry through the bilges. The pumps are still running, now operated by English sailors who have no idea what to do with a ship this size, this broken, this bloated. Efforts to unload her completely are delayed by disputes over ownership. Is the Queen owed 20%, 50%? Should the East India Company be formed to take over all future voyages? No decision is reached fast enough. And so the Mater de Deus begins to settle lower in the water, not from battle wounds or storm damage, but from neglect, indecision, and greed. The fate of the men who sailed her. Many of the Portuguese crew, those who survived both the voyage and the English boarding, are held as prisoners, but not harshly. Some are repatriated in diplomatic exchanges. A few are offered employment by the English to help identify cargo or explain Eastern trade. Some refuse, others agree. But none return home with their ship. The pilot, an aged man with cataracts and decades of Indian Ocean experience, dies quietly in a rented house in Exeter before he can be questioned. The English captain who oversaw the tow to Dartmouth drowns the following year in another engagement near the Azores. Almost everyone tied to the voyage finds fortune without stability or survival without reward. From floating palace to rotting shell. By October, barely 2 months after her arrival, the Mater de Deus is unrecognizable. Her outer planks are warped. Her sails, once thick and high, have been stripped. Her rigging hangs loose. The upper decks are torn apart, half for salvage, half for curiosity. Children climb aboard to pick up bits of porcelain. Thieves search the corners of the galley for anything the inventory clerks might have missed. A local fisherman remarks that she looks more like a sunken warehouse than a ship. The Queen orders her remaining cargo removed and the hull sold for scrap. No one buys it. Eventually, the ship is broken up where she sits, eaten by salt and bureaucracy. What remained? Despite the losses to theft and spoilage, the English crown still made an astounding profit. The recorded contents of the Mater de Deus, even at half strength, doubled the entire annual revenue of the English government that year. It was a windfall that changed English trade policy forever. Within a decade, formal plans began to circulate for the founding of a chartered company dedicated to trade in the East. In 1600, Queen Elizabeth granted the charter for the English East India Company. The lesson of the Mater de Deus had been learned. Riches are real. Ships can be taken. But treasure must be handled quickly, or the sea will take its share. Legacy, not legend. The Mater de Deus never became the stuff of poetic myth. She was too bloated, too bureaucratic, too real. But she mattered. Her capture and slow collapse offered a vision of global trade's fragility, the real danger of overreaching, and the reality that the most dangerous storm is not wind but weight. Not a rogue wave but a ledger too long, too tempting, too slow to reconcile. What happens when a ship meant to represent empire becomes a cautionary tale for ambition? What if the cost of survival is simply that you arrive too heavy to stand? She had no sails left, no crew who loved her, no hull to carry her further. And yet, for all her physical decay, the Mater de Deus was still dangerous, not as a ship of war, nor a storm-battered ghost, but as an idea. Because when a vessel drifts into harbor leaking nutmeg, leaking silver, and leaking rumors of entire floating cities in the East, governments change. Plans form. Empires rise. The Mater de Deus was not the first treasure ship to return from India. But she was the most visible failure of containment, a galleon bursting with wealth, too full to survive, and too tempting to ignore. This is how history often changes, not with flags or fireworks, but with spices rotting in a forgotten hold. A ship's anatomy as a warning. By late autumn 1592, the remains of the Mater de Deus had been stripped to little more than her bare ribs. Her decks were gone, repurposed into scaffolds and crates. Her hull lay open to the air, her bones blackened by salt and scavenging. But she was studied carefully. English shipwrights, still in the early years of developing their own ocean-going empire, walked her remains plank by plank. They took measurements of her hull curvature, sketched her internal compartments, and recorded the ratios of mast height to beam width. This was not idle curiosity. It was reverse engineering. The Portuguese had dominated Eastern trade for nearly a century, and their ships, especially their great carracks, had been military-industrial secrets. The Mater de Deus, broken though she was, provided a blueprint for English ambition. Within a generation, England would begin constructing its own massive vessels for the India run. And they would carry fewer guns and more cargo. Because the true war was commerce. The cargo list that sparked a dream. The final, official accounting of the Mater de Deus's hold, compiled by English customs agents, Raleigh's men, and Crown accountants, revealed goods from across the Eastern Hemisphere, including 425 tons of pepper, now considered as valuable by weight as gold in English markets. 45 tons of cloves, their aroma still clinging to dockside warehouses. 25 tons of cinnamon, damp but salvageable. 3 tons of nutmeg, previously rare in London, now traded in back alleys. 1.5 tons of benjamin, a kind of fragrant resin. Carpets, silks, damasks, and brocades from Persia and India. Bundles of Chinese silk, porcelain bowls, and inlaid lacquerware. A cache of rare books, including treatises on Eastern medicine, navigation, and philosophy, some believed to be the only copies in Europe at the time. Not all survived, some were stolen, some simply fell apart in the damp. But the very idea that such variety could exist aboard one ship, and from so many cultures, was intoxicating. Seeds of the East India Company. Though the English East India Company would not be officially founded until 1600, the seeds were planted right here, in the crowded warehouses of Dartmouth. Men in powdered wigs who had never seen India began forming investment circles. Letters were sent to Parliament, to the Queen's Court, to guilds and merchant adventurers. They wrote of a realm where pepper drops from trees and fabrics shimmer like water, where wealth is moved not by force, but by careful partnership. This was fantasy, yes, but it was a profitable one. And the wreck of the Mater de Deus was its keystone proof that such goods were real, attainable, and if taken properly, repeatable. A ship remembered without romance. Most ships remembered by history wear a cloak of heroism or tragedy, naval victory, discovery, or disaster. The Mater de Deus was none of those. She did not discover new lands. She did not sink gloriously in battle. She was captured slowly, looted methodically, and dismantled bureaucratically. But in that dull, procedural ending, she became the most influential ship most people have never heard of. No monuments were built. No ballads were written. And yet, without her, the trajectory of English maritime trade, of colonial ambition, of global capitalism might have remained slower, smaller. She was the catalyst disguised as cargo. The human cost forgotten. What is not often told is how many people never returned. The Portuguese crew, numbering over 500, suffered enormous losses. Dozens died en route, from malnutrition, infection, or heat stroke. Many were killed or wounded in the boarding action by the English. Others simply vanished, imprisoned, sold, or lost in the accounting shuffle. Their names are largely lost to history. We know more about the fate of the spices than the sailors. This is common in maritime records of empire. Human lives are measured in tonnage, value, or survivability, not story. But it's worth remembering. Behind every chest of cinnamon was a man who likely never touched land again. Echoes in the present. Today, no visible remains of the Mater de Deus exist, no wreck site, no museum replica. But her legacy survives in the shipping lanes she helped reshape, in the East India Company she unintentionally inspired, and in the economic systems that followed. She was an object lesson in excess and fragility, in the limits of cargo and the cost of greed. And perhaps most soberingly, she reminds us that survival is not always noble. Sometimes it's simply about not collapsing first. Final thought. The Mater de Deus began as a triumph of empire, a ship designed to haul a continent's wealth across the ocean. She ended as a rotting shell, plundered by allies, dismembered by dockworkers, and slowly broken by the very sea she had conquered. But in her undoing, she gave rise to something far larger. A new kind of empire. One not built on banners and crowns but on cargo manifests, maritime insurance and debt. And so she did not disappear. She was absorbed into ledgers, into stock exchanges, into trade routes still used today. A ship that, in sinking slowly, helped a nation rise swiftly. Story 7. The Aleutian Outcasts, shipwrecked on the edge of the map. The sky is gray, the wind is dry, and the sea smells like it hasn't moved in 100 years. In the distance, jagged islands rise from the Pacific like the spines of a sunken beast, inhospitable, mist-shrouded, and seemingly untouched by human hands. This is the Aleutian Archipelago, a brutal stretch of volcanic rock and weather halfway between Siberia and Alaska. And the year is 1741. A small group of Russian explorers, sailors, fur hunters, and mapmakers stand stranded on one of these remote islands. Their ship, the St. Peter, is gone or beyond reach. Their supplies are dwindling. The cold is creeping under their nails. No one will come looking for them, because no one officially knows exactly where they are. This is the beginning of a survival story so stark, so sparse, so forgotten that it rarely makes history books. And yet it quietly shaped the Russian colonization of Alaska and the Pacific fur trade that followed. This is the story of the outcasts of Bering's crew, and how they clung to life in the furthest corner of the map. The man behind the mission. At the center of this story, though not for long, was Vitus Bering, a Danish-born navigator in Russian service. Under Tsar Peter the Great and later Empress Anna, Bering had been tasked with the immense Second Kamchatka expedition, a project so vast it took 10 years to plan, fund, and execute, involving thousands of men, dozens of ships, and the aim of charting Russia's easternmost frontiers. Bering's goal: to determine whether Asia and North America were connected by land or sea. By 1741, he had made it as far as the Pacific coast and launched 2 ships from Petropavlovsk, the St. Peter, which he commanded, and the St. Paul, under Alexei Kyrikov. They were separated in a storm shortly after departure. Each sailed east, toward an unknown and unmapped world. Only one returned. The voyage that went too far. The St. Peter, with a crew of about 77 men, was not built for comfort. Supplies were limited. Fresh water was a constant concern, and the weather turned foul as they approached the North American coast. They sighted land, what is now Alaska, in July 1741. They stayed long enough to fill barrels with fresh water, chop down trees, and make some rudimentary observations. But the crew was already showing signs of illness, scurvy, that ancient curse of long-distance mariners. Bering ordered them back to Kamchatka. They never made it. Storms pushed them south, then east. Supplies ran low. Men collapsed in the rigging. And finally, in November, they wrecked on a barren, uncharted island somewhere in the Aleutians. The island with no name. Today, we call it Bering Island. But to the men marooned there, it was simply wind, rock, and cold. There were no trees. No visible settlements. No ships. Only seals, birds, and waves. The wreckage of the St. Peter lay scattered across the shore, Some planks could be salvaged for shelter, others had to be burned for warmth. A few sails were stretched over makeshift huts. The men, weakened by disease and cold, dug shallow holes to escape the wind. They began to die quickly. Buring himself aged, exhausted, and ill was carried inland by his men and laid in a shallow shelter of driftwood and sod. He died in December 1741, barely a month after their landing. He was buried nearby in a grave that was likely unmarked and soon erased by weather. Living with the sea beast. For those who survived the first winter, the only path forward was to watch the animals. The island was, ironically, rich in life, not human life, but furred and feathered abundance. The men quickly began hunting the sea otters, northern fur seals, and stellar sea cows, a now extinct species of enormous, docile marine mammal related to the manatee. They developed methods to render blubber into oil, cook seal meat over stone fires, and preserve what little food they had in ice pits. Some even began to domesticate the habits of seabirds, collecting eggs from cliff ledges or trapping birds in rock circles. But it was brutal work. Frostbite was constant. Many were too sick to contribute. And there was no horizon, no visible rescue, and no clear knowledge of how far from home they truly were. Shelter, then strategy. By spring 1742, perhaps half the original crew remained. Led now by Lieutenant Sven Waxel, the acting commander, they began to think beyond survival. They salvaged more wood from the wrecked St. Peter. They built tools from iron scraps, bone, and driftwood. They drew crude memory maps based on currents, bird flight, and the few stars visible in the gloom. And then they began to build a new ship. What happens when survival is no longer about fire and food, but about rebuilding a future with splinters, salt, and memory? The only trees on the island were those that drifted in from elsewhere. No tall pines, no sheltering birch, no living forests. And yet, under the endless gray skies of the Aleutian spring, the stranded crew of the St. Peter began the unthinkable, constructing a seaworthy vessel from the remains of the ship that had wrecked them, the frozen earth around them, and the ingenuity of men who had nothing left to lose. They had no shipyard, no forge, no blueprint, but they had experience, muscle memory, and a desperate need not to die in silence. The wreck reborn. The St. Peter had shattered on the shore of what is now Buring Island. Some of her hull remained embedded in the sand, torn apart by waves. Her spars and masts had snapped or been stripped by the wind. Her sails were rags. But beneath the surface, buried in wet sand and ice, the keel remained intact, the spine of the vessel. It was a start. The survivors, led by acting commander Sven Waxel and ship's carpenter Sava Starodubtsev, began what was less a rebuilding and more a reinvention of their former ship. They dug into the half-frozen beach to retrieve usable timbers. They fashioned nails from leftover iron, melted and beaten into shape over seal-fat flames. They reshaped planks with stone tools, some borrowed from native Aleut caches they discovered. For rigging, they twisted seal intestines and sinew. They called it the new St. Peter. It was smaller, lighter, but it had a sail it could carry the survivors. It was hope nailed together. Daily life among the bones. Construction took months. Meanwhile, daily life was a brutal, unchanging cycle. Hunt seals. Boil meat and blubber. Repair clothing made from fur and stitched skin. Tend to the sick. Dig graves when the weak finally expired. The men who survived the first winter grew leaner, quieter, more focused. Their faces were weather-beaten and blank, the sort that comes not from fear, but from knowing there is no alternative to endurance. There were no fires for warmth, only cooking. The wind scattered heat before it could comfort. Most slept in pits dug into the earth, lined with sod and otter pelts. But they endured, watching the animals leave. In late spring, the sea cow's massive, slow-moving giants began to migrate. Their presence had been a blessing, easy to hunt, impossible to chase off. But they were also finite. By the 1760s, just 27 years later, the stellar sea cow would be extinct. Already, the outcasts of Bering's crew sensed they had overhunted. The animals began avoiding the shallows near camp. The men, in return, had to walk farther, wait longer, risk more. They kept no formal journal of the wildlife's decline. But in the quiet exchanges between men on night watch, the realization grew. The island provides, but not forever. Encounters with the Aleuts. Though initially believed uninhabited, the island was occasionally visited by native Aleut people from nearby islands. These visits were rare and cautious. The Aleuts were skilled sea hunters, masters of the Baedarka, a type of skin kayak built for speed and stealth. They traded quietly, observed from a distance, and left before growing too familiar. But some of Bering's men learned to recognize their patterns. When they fished, how they built their temporary shelters, what plants they harvested. There may have been exchanges blubber for bone knives or fish for cloth, but the record is thin, mostly inferred from fragments. What is clear is that the Aleuts survived here by being light, mobile, and attuned to the island's rhythms. Bering's stranded crew, in contrast, survived by reshaping the landscape to their needs. Two different strategies. Two different kinds of resilience. Finishing the new St. Peter. By July 1742, 8 months after their wreck, the new ship was ready. It was a small, single-masted vessel, just large enough to carry the 40-some survivors, provisions, and hope. They loaded it with seal meat, blubber for oil, and water collected in hollowed bones. They said nothing ceremonial as they launched it. Just the steady labor of pushing a hull into frigid surf and praying the boards would hold. The journey home. They sailed west, back across the Bering Sea. No compass, no charts, just dead reckoning, instinct, and the memory of stars glimpsed on calmer nights. The journey took weeks. Storms dogged them but never shattered them. Scurvy re-emerged. They bled from their gums. They shook with chills, but the men rowed, bailed, navigated, and held on. When they finally reached Petropavlovsk, they were skeletal, sun-scarred, and nearly silent. But they were alive. The official reaction. Their return shocked the Russian authorities. They had been presumed lost. The St. Paul under Kyrikov had returned with only fragments of news. No one had expected survivors. The men were debriefed. Their survival amazed some, embarrassed others. Because in their story was an uncomfortable truth. Russia had sent them too far, too ill-equipped, and with too little regard. No medals awaited them. Just more missions, and eventually, the slow burial of their story under paperwork. What does it mean to survive in a place where maps fail and the wind speaks no language you know, when your only legacy may be that you endured long enough to return, and that's it? By the time the last of Bering's stranded crew returned to Russian soil in 1742, no one truly understood what they had done. There was no parade, no official celebration. Most of their names, except for Bering and a handful of officers, would fade from records. And yet, their ordeal had quietly triggered the expansion of an empire. Not because they planted flags, not because they claimed territory, but because they returned with knowledge, maps, and stories of fur-bearing animals in uncharted lands, and that was more valuable than any flag could ever be. Aftermath on Bering Island. Back on the wind-battered rock they'd abandoned, the signs of their passage faded quickly. The seal-hide huts collapsed with the first snow. Their grave mounds flattened in the storms. Their scavenged camp rotted into the landscape. But not entirely. In the decades that followed, Russian traders and trappers began arriving in the Aleutians in increasing numbers, and some of them noted remnants. Bits of metal tools, too refined for local use. Pieces of foreign timber, not native to the islands. Stone-lined pits and soot-stained stones in cave mouths. They had become ghosts in the landscape, not by legend but by archaeology. And for the few Aleut elders who had seen the starving Russians scrape out their survival, the story passed into memory as one of both awe and confusion. Why had these men come here? And why had they stayed so long? The extinction nobody noticed. One of the clearest consequences of the marooned crew's time on the island was the beginning of the end for the stellar sea cow. Discovered and named by the expedition's naturalist, Georg Wilhelm Steller, the creature was described in vivid detail. A gentle animal of prodigious size, moving slowly through the shallows, chewing kelp with the placidity of grazing cattle. Steller loved the sea cow. He tried to keep the men from overhunting it. But they were starving, and the creature, weighing over 8,000 pounds, could feed dozens. By 1768, less than 3 decades after first being recorded, the last confirmed Steller sea cow was killed. The species had been wiped out by a handful of castaways and the rush that followed. It is one of the fastest known mammalian extinctions caused by humans. A stark reminder that even survival leaves scars. Steller's notes and the science of survival. Steller, too, barely survived the return voyage. Though weakened and often bedridden during their time on the island, he kept careful notes on the animals they encountered, the plants they attempted to eat, some poisonous, some life-saving, the behavior of the weather, tides, and local birds. These notes were smuggled back to St. Petersburg and later published in German. They would form the foundation of Arctic zoology in Russia and influenced natural science in Europe for decades. His descriptions of sea otters alone would later spark the Russian-American fur trade, which funded expeditions deep into Alaska and the Pacific Northwest. The science in this case was born not in a university but in a hut made of driftwood and animal skin, beside a graveyard of forgotten men. The men who were left behind in the records. Of the original 77 aboard the St. Peter, roughly 46 survived. Some would return to the Navy. Others disappeared into Kamchatka's frontier. A few stayed in the region to guide future expeditions, often underpaid, barely thanked. Their names appeared briefly in naval dispatches, often misspelled, and then vanished. This was typical. Russian imperial efforts, like those of other empires, treated labor as expendable. What mattered was the return on investment: furs, maps, viable trade routes. But the men who sewed sails from seal hide, who carved timber with bone tools, who buried friends in frost-hardened ground, they were the ones who proved that survival was possible. Their knowledge was passed informally, crew to crew, rumor to report. And it was from that murmur that Russia built a maritime frontier. The quiet beginning of a colonial project. Following the survival and reports of Bering's men, Russian Promyshleniki fur traders began setting up seasonal camps on the Aleutian Islands. These were rough, temporary, and exploitative. The Aleut people were forced into labor, often violently. Many were killed. Entire villages were depopulated by disease or destroyed in retaliatory raids. What the outcasts of 1741 had begun in desperation became, by 1750, a pattern of conquest. But the geography was against Russia. Supplies from the mainland were irregular, the winters were brutal, the distance too great. And so, ironically, the lessons from the St. Peter's survivors remained relevant. How to build from scraps, how to listen to local rhythms, how to endure when forgotten. The empire expanded, but it did so on the backs of men trained by survival. Reflections from the Edge. To visit Bering Island today, is to encounter a place still defined by its silence. It is part of Russia's Komandorsky Nature Reserve, home to seabirds, seals, and foxes, but no permanent population. There are no monuments to the castaways, no plaque for Steller's sea cows. Only the wind, the kelp beds, and the stones where they once dug their pits. But their story lingers, not as legend, not as myth, but as a quiet, documented truth, that ordinary men, with no audience and no rescue, can endure the worst the world offers and in doing so, alter the shape of a continent's future. Final thought. History often favors drama grand discoveries, violent conquests, or sweeping revolutions. But sometimes, history turns because a small group of forgotten men didn't die. They didn't build an empire. They simply lasted long enough to let someone else try. And that too is power. Story 8, The Shipwreck of the Batavia, Mutiny on the Coral Coast. The early morning air was still, the sea deceptive blue, quiet, almost inviting. And then came the jolt. A thunderous, splintering crack echoed through the hull of the Batavia, followed by silence, then chaos. In an instant, the flagship of the Dutch East India Company's 1628 fleet, laden with silver, spices, and passengers, was aground on a coral reef off the coast of what is now Western Australia. There was no storm, no enemy cannon fire, no foul play yet. Just a miscalculation, a silent reef, and a world that was about to descend into a horrifying chain of survival, power, and madness. This is not a story about a simple shipwreck. It is a story about what happens when rescue is uncertain and order collapses. A ship bound for the east. The Batavia was built in Amsterdam and launched in 1628 as a new jewel in the fleet of the VOC, the Verenigd Oostindische Compagnie, or Dutch East India Company. She was built for speed and cargo, carrying over 300 people, sailors, soldiers, merchants, and civilians, and loaded with silver coin intended for trade in Java, fine textiles, supplies for colonial outposts. Her destination was Batavia, the capital of the Dutch East Indies, now Jakarta, Indonesia. She was the floating embodiment of Dutch commercial ambition. But what no one on board yet knew was that the real danger lay not in the sea but among themselves. The men of the Batavia. Commanding the ship was Francisco Pelsaert, a VOC senior merchant, technically in charge of the expedition. His authority, however, often clashed with that of the ship's captain, Arjen Jacobs, a man known for his arrogance, drinking, and short temper. Also aboard was Jeronimus Cornelis, a failed apothecary fleeing bankruptcy and disgrace. Intelligent, charismatic, and deeply cynical, Cornelis would soon reveal himself as one of the most chilling figures in maritime history. Tensions simmered from the beginning. Class conflict, personal rivalries, and whispers of mutiny brewed in the lower decks. And then came the wreck. A reef without rescue. On June 4, 1629, the Batavia struck the Morning Reef in the Houtman Abralhos, a remote coral chain off Australia's west coast. The hull split, the rudder broke, water poured in. There was no land in sight, only sharp reefs and treacherous shoals. The ship was lost. But most of the people on board managed to escape onto nearby islands, carrying what provisions they could in small boats and makeshift rafts. The main island, Beacon Island, would soon become infamous. Later it would be known by another name. Batavia's graveyard. A commander's departure. With limited water, no shelter, and no certainty of where they were, Pelsaert made a decision. He would take a small group, including the captain and some crew, and attempt to sail nearly 2,000 miles north to Batavia, Jakarta, in a longboat to seek rescue. He left behind 268 men, women, and children, promising to return. The longboat's voyage was perilous, but successful and impressive feat of navigation and endurance. Yet what happened during the weeks of his absence would stain the history of shipwrecks forever. Because the man left unofficially in charge, Jeronimus Cornelis had no intention of waiting peacefully. A descent into madness. Cornelis quickly took control of the survivors. As a VOC officer, though low-ranking, he presented himself as the logical leader. Many believed him, others simply hoped for stability. But Cornelis had a plan. He knew that Pelsaert would return with a rescue ship, and possibly with justice. Cornelis wanted power, not salvation. So he began to eliminate potential threats. At first, he withheld food and water from the sick and weak. Then, using a group of loyal followers, some of them former mutiny plotters, he began a systematic purge. Men were strangled, stabbed, or drowned. Women were claimed as property, subjected to months of unspeakable abuse. Dissenters were exiled to nearby islands without supplies, left to die. This was not a descent into chaos. It was a cold, calculated regime of terror. The Silent Islands. One of the islands, now called Traitors' Island, became the home of a group of soldiers and dissenters Cornelis had cast off. Left without food or water, they were meant to perish quietly. But they did not. They found a brackish well, they fished, they hunted birds, and slowly they formed a plan. If rescue ever came, they would signal it. And if Cornelis tried to kill them, they would fight back. They were not soldiers anymore. They were survivors. Pelsaert's return. Months later, Pelsaert returned aboard the rescue ship Sardom, only to find a nightmare. The survivors he left had become murderers, rebels, and victims. The dead could not be counted. Bones littered the sand. The women were traumatized. The survivors on Traitors' Island signaled frantically, warning the rescuers not to trust Cornelis. A battle ensued, brief but violent. Cornelis was captured, tried, and executed on the spot, his hands chopped off before he was hanged. His followers met similar fates. Some were tried in Batavia, others were marooned as punishment. Only about 120 people survived the entire ordeal. How could one man, with no weapons or title, build a kingdom of horror on a patch of sand? What do shipwrecks reveal not about the sea, but about ourselves when the tide recedes and power is up for grabs? Beacon Island was no paradise. It was a scatter of coral, sand, and heat without shade, without fresh water, and with only sparse patches of brush to offer the illusion of shelter. The air shimmered under the sun. The horizon offered nothing but a cruel line of distant blue. And yet, for Jeronimus Cornelis, this was the perfect place to build a kingdom. Not one of glory or legitimacy, but of control. A small, brutal republic of fear. His enemies were sick, unarmed, terrified. And with each passing day, Cornelis became more certain. If he could eliminate dissent, kill the weak, and seize every resource, then when Pelsaert returned, he would negotiate from strength or perhaps kill the rescuers and take the ship himself. What happened next was not mutiny, it was calculated extermination. Phase 1. Starvation as policy. Cornelis began subtly. He organized his followers, men who had already discussed mutiny on the Batavia or those susceptible to promises of spoils and women. He gave them roles, food, and a place in his vision. The rest of the survivors, the sick, the wounded, the women and children, were treated as a burden. Cornelis claimed there were limited rations, only the strong would eat. And so the weak began to starve. This first wave of deaths came not with knives, but with neglect. The cries of children went unanswered. The elderly were left in the sun. By doing nothing, Cornelis tightened his grip. Phase 2. The purge. Once he controlled the food, Cornelis moved into open violence. He had men strangled in the night. Others were stabbed and thrown into the sea. Some were taken out by boat to deeper waters and pushed overboard. A group of dissenters, mainly soldiers, were exiled to West Wallaby Island, told there was no place for them. They were given no food, no water. They were expected to die. Instead, they would learn to fish, find water, and plot his downfall. Cornwallis controlled everything: food, shelter, weapons. His word was law. But the killings did not stop. Because with each death, a twisted logic grew stronger. If I've killed one, I may as well kill 10. And if 10, then 20. The women of the Batavia. Of all the survivors, the women suffered most. Among them was Lucretia Jans, a Dutch gentlewoman traveling to join her husband in Batavia. She had been a passenger of status, educated, refined, and now trapped on a barren reef with monsters. Cornwallis took her for himself. She was forced to act as his concubine, a role both symbolic and strategic. Her presence allowed him to present an image of control, even civility. She became, unwillingly, a symbol of his twisted claim to power. Other women were handed out as wives to his followers, raped, beaten, sometimes killed when they resisted. And yet, even within this cruelty, there was resistance. Lucretia, despite her circumstances, would later testify in detail, helping ensure Cornwallis's legacy would be known, not forgotten. Her voice, documented in Pelsert's journal, survived where many others did not. Meanwhile, on the edge, the soldiers' island. On West Wallaby, the soldiers Cornwallis had exiled were not dying. Led by Weeb Hayes, a low-ranking soldier with little formal authority, they had done something remarkable. Built crude shelters from coral and driftwood. Located a freshwater spring, the only known one in the island group. Organized themselves into watches and foraging parties. Crafted stone weapons and practiced basic defenses. They had no way of knowing what horrors were unfolding on Beacon Island. But they knew enough to prepare for a fight. Because eventually they were sure Cornwallis would come for them. Phase 3, the war begins. Cornwallis did not want a rival camp to exist. It challenged his authority. Worse, it represented a competing source of survival. So he launched raiding parties, small bands of armed men in rowboats, hopping to capture or kill the soldiers. But Hayes and his men were ready. Using coral rocks and crude clubs, they repelled the attackers. It was the first sign that Cornwallis's grip was slipping. The once unchallenged governor of a sandbar now faced an enemy with water, food, and cohesion. The clock runs out. Cornwallis grew erratic. He launched more attacks. Executions resumed on Beacon Island, including of his own men for perceived disloyalty. He tried to capture Hayes's water source but failed. And then, just as he began planning a final strike, a sail appeared on the horizon. Pelsert had returned. A kingdom ends in chains. As Pelsert and the rescuers approached, Cornwallis attempted to feign innocence. He lied, shifted blame, and tried to present the soldiers as mutineers. But the survivors of West Wallaby had already told their story. Cornwallis was arrested. Pelsert, furious and overwhelmed by the scale of the murders, conducted a tribunal on the sand. Lacking prison cells or transport for all, he ordered immediate execution of the worst offenders. Cornwallis had his hands cut off, then was hanged. His followers, tied with ropes, were either executed or returned to Batavia for trial. The makeshift empire of sand and bones crumbled in a single day. But its shadow would linger. The VOC's uncomfortable problem. The Dutch East India Company was not pleased. Not because of the deaths, they were not unaccustomed to violence in colonial contexts, but because of the publicity risk. A VOC ship, its crew turned murderers, its officers incompetent. It was bad for business. Pelsert's detailed journal, however, was too thorough to suppress. It circulated quietly among VOC circles. then was published, fueling a minor scandal in Europe and cementing the Batavia disaster as one of the most infamous shipwreck stories in maritime history. Final reflection. Cornelis was not a captain. He had no weapons, no authority, no army. But he had opportunity, and in a vacuum of power, that was enough. The Batavia's wreck reminds us that shipwrecks are not just tests of survival, but tests of character, of society, of who we become when the world shrinks to a sandbar, and civilization is reduced to food, water, and fear. The coral sands of Beacon Island, bleached white by centuries of sun and salt, still hide bones beneath their surface. Some are fragments, jawbones, ribs, vertebrae buried shallow in the shifting earth. Others lie deeper, wrapped in sediment and mystery. They belong to the forgotten victims of the Batavia disaster, murdered passengers, discarded mutineers, lost women and children. For years after 1629, the island sat quiet again. No monuments, no markers, just wind, tide, and the slow erosion of memory. But the aftermath of the Batavia shipwreck didn't end with the execution of Cornelis. Its legacy continued through the stories told in VOC boardrooms, whispered on future voyages, and eventually unearthed by archaeologists and historians centuries later. This is the quiet epilogue of that brutal story, the ripples it caused, the lessons it offered, and the remains that refused to disappear. After the hangings, with Cornelis executed and the worst of his followers dead or awaiting trial, Pelsert's next task was grim and logistical. The Sardom, the rescue ship, could not hold everyone at once. Survivors were ferried in groups. The dead were buried hastily, if at all. The wounded physically and emotionally were given little reprieve. There was no compensation, no formal apology from the VOC, no reassignment of blame. Instead, Pelsert compiled a comprehensive report for the Dutch East India Company. This journal would become one of the most detailed surviving accounts of shipwreck survival and mutiny in maritime history. But within his account is a telling silence. He rarely speaks of his own decisions. He avoids reflecting on whether abandoning the majority of the passengers had worsened the outcome. He leaves out much about the treatment of the women. He does, however, describe the executions in detail. Perhaps he believed that justice, however swift, balanced the scales. Justice in Batavia. Of the mutineers transported to Batavia for trial, many were hanged. A few were broken on the wheel, a form of execution where bones were shattered before death. Others were strangled, the Dutch preferred method of controlled execution. Only 2 men, young and only peripherally involved, were shown mercy of a kind. They were marooned on the Australian coast, left with minimal supplies as a form of exile. Their fates are unknown. Some believe they perished within days. Others speculate they may have encountered indigenous Australians and lived for a time. But no trace of them was ever found. Lucretia Jans and the surviving women. Lucretia Jans, whose endurance through Cornelis's terror was remarkable, returned to Batavia and later to the Netherlands. Though she gave formal testimony, she received no formal restitution. Her name faded from records not long after the trial. Other women survivors also disappeared from the archives, some remarried, others died in the Indies. Their trauma, unrecorded, was absorbed into the silence that colonial bureaucracies so often imposed. But from Pelsert's journal and court testimony, fragments of their voices endure. And those voices remind us. Survival is not always escape, sometimes it's endurance. The VOC's takeaway. For the Dutch East India Company, the Batavia disaster became a cautionary tale not of cruelty, but of logistics and leadership. Future voyages included tighter officer oversight, clearer chain-of-command protocols, more frequent use of marine chaplains to maintain moral order. But the underlying reality remained. VOC ships were pressure cookers, floating containers of class tension, religious division, and authoritarian discipline. The Batavia was unique in how far it fell, but not in the conditions that made it possible. The bones resurface. For centuries, the story of the Batavia remained a maritime footnote, retold in sailors' taverns and Dutch shipping logs. But in the 20th century, archaeologists began a more formal effort to locate and study the site. In 1963, the wreck of the Batavia was finally found in the Abrolhos Reef. Since then, excavations on Beacon Island have uncovered human remains, some clearly showing signs of trauma consistent with murder. Artifacts from the ship have been recovered, including coins, weapons, and personal items. The remains have been reburied respectfully, many in memorial sites recognizing the tragedy. There is now a Batavia gallery at the Western Australian Museum in Fremantle, where visitors can view parts of the hull, preserved through careful conservation. The story that was once hidden beneath coral and time is now displayed, quietly, and without sensationalism, for those who wish to learn. Why it still matters. The Batavia wreck remains one of the worst maritime mutinies in recorded history, not because of its body count, but because of what it reveals about power, fear, and leadership in isolation. There was no storm, no enemy fleet, no catastrophic mechanical failure. What destroyed the Batavia's passengers was a moral collapse, accelerated by hierarchy, cruelty, and the vacuum left when structure fails. In that sense, the story is not just about 1629. It is about every small group stranded, every crisis in isolation, every test of human nature when rescue seems far and rules grow soft. Final reflection. The remains of the Batavia lie not just in the sand and sea, but in the fragile structures of civilization we carry with us, even to the ends of the world. When those structures are stripped away by shipwreck, by silence, by time, what's left is the raw material of human choice. And that, perhaps more than any treasure lost to the reef, is the true weight of the Batavia's legacy.